Hello, welcome back to the Sleepy Universe. Just relax and listen to the words. The French Revolution and the Rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 1: The Sparks of Rebellion. The sun set over Paris in the summer of 1789, casting long, golden shadows across streets that hummed with a quiet, dangerous energy. To a casual observer walking along the banks of the Seine, the city might have appeared as magnificent as ever. The grand stone facade of Notre Dame stood tall against the twilight, the gilded gates of royal palaces sparkled in the dying light, and the aroma of freshly baked bread drifted from neighborhood kitchens. Yet beneath this surface of classic French grandeur, a profound restlessness was stirring. The nation was holding its breath, poised on the edge of a transformation that would shatter the old world and redefine the destiny of Europe. For centuries, France had operated under a system known as the Ancien Régime, or the Old Order. It was a social structure built like a rigid pyramid, unchanged for generations. At the very top sat the monarch, King Louis XVI, whose authority was believed to be granted by divine right. Directly beneath the crown were two privileged classes, known together as the First and Second Estates. The First Estate was composed of the clergy, the high-ranking leaders of the Catholic Church who controlled vast stretches of fertile land and held immense political influence. The Second Estate consisted of the nobility, dukes, counts, and aristocrats who held the grandest titles, occupied the highest positions in government and the military, and lived lives of opulent luxury. Together, these two upper estates made up a tiny fraction of the population, barely 2% of the French people. Yet they possessed the vast majority of the nation's wealth, influence, and land. Crucially, they enjoyed exemptions from most forms of taxation. The financial weight of the kingdom fell almost entirely onto the shoulders of everyone else, the Third Estate. The Third Estate was not a uniform group, it was a vast, diverse tapestry comprising 98% of the nation. It included wealthy merchants, educated lawyers, doctors, and scholars, collectively known as the bourgeoisie, who possessed intelligence and ambition but were locked out of political power simply because they lacked noble blood. It also included urban artisans, shopkeepers, and labourers who struggled daily with rising rents and low wages. Finally, at the very base of the pyramid were millions of peasant farmers who worked the soil, tied to centuries-old feudal obligations that required them to pay heavy taxes to the king, tithes to the church, and rents to their local landlords. For decades, this imbalance had been quietly tolerated, held together by tradition and the absolute power of the throne. But as the 18th century drew toward its close, the pillar supporting this ancient structure began to crack. The first major strain was financial. France, despite its cultural brilliance and military prestige, was virtually bankrupt. Decades of expensive foreign wars had drained the royal treasury. Most recently, King Louis XVI had poured vast sums of money, troops, and naval support across the Atlantic to assist the American colonies in their fight for independence from Britain. While the American Revolution succeeded in birthing a new republic, it left France burdened with a staggering national debt. The interest payments alone consumed more than half of the royal budget each year. To make matters worse, the forces of nature seemed to align against the kingdom. The late 1780s brought a series of severe weather disasters across the French countryside. Terrible droughts were followed by brutal hailstorms that ruined crops, and the winter of 1788 was one of the coldest in recorded history. Rivers froze solid, mills stopped grinding grain, and transportation ground to a halt. When spring arrived, the price of bread, the fundamental staple of the ordinary French diet, soared to unprecedented heights. For the common family in Paris or the rural villages, bread was not merely a side dish, it was life itself. As prices climbed, a working person might spend up to 80% of their daily income on a single loaf. Hunger quickly turned into desperation, and desperation turned into anger. Whispers began to circulate through the crowded taverns and bustling marketplaces. Why should the people starve while the court at Versailles dined on fine meats and sweet wines behind high stone walls? Versailles was a realm unto itself. Located roughly 12 miles southwest of Paris, the Grand Palace was a monument to absolute monarchy. Constructed decades earlier by Louis XIV, the Sun King, Versailles was designed to awe and intimidate. Its hall of mirrors stretched on endlessly, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, while its sprawling gardens featured grand fountains and perfectly manicured hedges. Here lived King Louis XVI and his Austrian-born queen, Marie Antoinette. Louis was not a malicious ruler. By many accounts, he was a quiet, well-meaning man who preferred lock-making and geography to court politics. However, he lacked the decisive leadership and firm resolve needed to navigate a financial crisis of this magnitude. Marie Antoinette, young and raised in the imperial court of Vienna, became an easy target for public frustration. Her extravagant fashion, elaborate hairstyles, and preference for secluded retreat at her private estate, the Petit Trianon, earned her the mocking nickname Madame Deficit. Though many of the rumors about her extreme wastefulness were exaggerated by political opponents, the perception remained the royal court was completely detached from the suffering of the common people. As the financial crisis deepened, Louis XVI realized that ordinary measures would no longer suffice. His financial ministers warned him that the only way to save France from bankruptcy was to tax the nobility and the clergy. Unsurprisingly, the First and Second Estates fiercely resisted, insisting that only a historical assembly known as the Estates General had the authority to approve major new taxes. The Estates General was an ancient representative assembly that brought together leaders from all three estates. It had not been summoned in 175 years, not since 1614, because absolute monarchs preferred to govern without consulting their subjects. Desperate for a solution, Louis XVI yielded and called for the Estates General to convene at Versailles in May of 1789. Across the nation, an extraordinary wave of activity began. Elections were held in towns and villages to select delegates for each estate. Along with their representatives, the people were invited to compile lists of grievances, known as cahiers de doléances. From every corner of France, thousands of notebooks poured in, filled with the voices of peasants, shopkeepers, and merchants. They asked for fair taxation, relief from feudal dues, freedom of the press, and a voice in their own governance. A spirit of hope spread through the country. Perhaps, at long last, the king was listening. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General officially opened at Versailles. The opening ceremony was a spectacle of splendor and rigid social hierarchy. The nobility wore rich silk coats and hats adorned with feathers, the high clergy wore radiant robes of purple and red. The representatives of the Third Estate, by contrast, were instructed to wear simple black suits, visually emphasizing their subordinate status. As the meetings began, a fundamental structural flaw immediately paralyzed the assembly: the voting system. Traditionally, each estate met separately and cast one collective vote on any issue. This meant that whenever the Third Estate proposed reforms, the First and Second Estates could join together and outvote them 2-1, despite representing only a tiny fraction of the population. The delegates of the Third Estate, led by passionate lawyers, thinkers, and reform-minded intellectuals, refused to accept this rigged dynamic. They argued that all three estates should meet together in a single assembly, and that each individual delegate should have one vote. Since the Third Estate had been granted double the number of delegates to reflect their population, this change would give them a fair chance to pass meaningful reforms. For weeks, the debate raged back and forth in the heated halls of Versailles. The king, hesitant and torn between competing advisors, failed to step in with a decisive resolution. The nobles refused to give up their voting advantage, hoping the Third Estate would eventually tire and back down. They underestimated the resolve of the Third Estate. On June 17, 1789, taking a bold and unprecedented step, the delegates of the Third Estate declared that they were no longer merely representatives of a single class. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true legal representatives of the entire French nation. They invited delegates from the clergy and nobility to join them, announcing their intention to begin drafting a new constitution for France. This was an act of quiet, revolutionary defiance. By claiming authority independent of the crown, the National Assembly was asserting that sovereignty did not belong solely to the king, but to the people. 3 days later, on the morning of June 20th, the delegates of the newly formed National Assembly arrived at their meeting hall, only to find the doors locked and guarded by royal soldiers. Official notices claimed the hall was closed for repairs, but the delegates suspected the king was preparing to dissolve their assembly by force. Refusing to be silenced, the delegates looked for an alternative space nearby. Through the rainy morning streets, they marched to a large indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume, used by the royal court. Gathering on the wooden floor of the echoing sports hall, surrounded by bare walls, the delegates raised their hands in solemn unity. Led by their president, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, they took a dramatic pledge that would echo through history, the tennis court oath. They swore never to separate, and to reassemble wherever circumstances required, until they had established a written constitution for the Kingdom of France. The news of the tennis court oath sent shockwaves through Versailles and Paris. Realizing that the movement was gaining unstoppable momentum, a growing number of progressive nobles and low-ranking parish priests left their traditional chambers to join the National Assembly. Recognizing he had lost control of the situation, Louis XVI reluctantly gave in, ordering the remaining nobles and clergy to join the assembly as well. On paper, it appeared to be a peaceful victory for reform. But beneath the surface, tension was building to a dangerous high. Rumors began to sweep through Paris that the king's conservative advisors were persuading him to take back control through military force. These fears were confirmed when troops, including foreign mercenary regiments loyal to the crown, began gathering around the perimeter of Paris and Versailles. The city of Paris was transformed into a powder keg. Citizens gathered in public squares, eager for news, their anxiety turning into outright alarm. On July 11th, the spark was struck. King Louis XVI dismissed his popular financial minister, Jacques Necker, who was seen by the public as the people's chief advocate within the royal government. To the citizens of Paris, Necker's firing was the ultimate sign that a royal crackdown was imminent. The following morning, Sunday, July 12th, the news of Necker's dismissal reached Paris. Spontaneous crowds poured into the streets and parks. At the Palais Royal, a vibrant public garden and meeting place, a passionate young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a café table outside. Holding a pistol in his hand, his voice ringing out over the gathering crowd, he delivered a rallying cry that would change the course of history: to arms! To arms! The king's foreign regiments are coming to cut our throats. We have only one chance: to take up weapons. Desmoulins plucked a green leaf from a nearby tree and pinned it to his hat as a ribbon of hope and unity. Within minutes, thousands of citizens followed his example, crafting makeshift green ribbons from plants, fabric, and paper. The crowd surged through the streets, demanding weapons to defend themselves and their city against the approaching royal armies. Over the next 48 hours, Paris descended into organized chaos. The citizens formed a makeshift municipal government and established a civilian militia, which would soon become known as the National Guard. To arm this new force, crowds visited gunsmiths and public armories across the city. On the morning of July 14th, a massive group marched to the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital, where they successfully seized over 30,000 muskets. However, the muskets were practically useless without gunpowder. And the citizens knew exactly where the royal army stored vast supplies of black powder, a formidable, medieval fortress standing at the eastern edge of the city. The Bastille. The Bastille was a massive stone stronghold featuring 8 towering round towers, surrounded by a deep, water-filled moat and guarded by heavy drawbridges. Built in the 14th century, it had long served as a state prison. Over the generations, political dissidents, critical writers, and opponents of the crown had been locked away behind its thick stone walls by secret royal orders. Though by 1789 it held only 7 prisoners, the imposing structure remained the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny and absolute power in the heart of Paris. By mid-morning on July 14, 1789, thousands of armed Parisians, joined by rebellious members of the French Guards, surrounded the fortress. They were not initially seeking a dramatic battle. Their primary goal was to demand the surrender of the gunpowder stored within and the removal of the heavy cannons mounted on the ramparts, which were pointed directly at the crowded civilian neighborhoods below. The governor of the Bastille, the Marquis de Launay, met with representatives of the crowd inside his quarters. He offered them hospitality and agreed to pull back the cannons, but he firmly refused to hand over the gunpowder or surrender the fortress. As the hours dragged on, the crowd growing outside in the heat of the afternoon became increasingly anxious. Seeing the heavy drawbridges raised and hearing rumors that reinforcements were on the way, a few daring individuals managed to scale the outer walls of the courtyard. Using axes, they chopped through the heavy iron chain supporting the outer drawbridge. With a thunderous crash, the heavy wooden gate slammed down, and the crowd surged into the inner courtyard. Mistaking this advance for a direct attack, the defenders atop the ramparts opened fire. Musket shots echoed off the stone walls, and smoke filled the courtyard. What had begun as a tense standoff immediately transformed into a full-scale assault. For hours, the citizens fought back with their newly acquired muskets, but they lacked the heavy firepower needed to break through the main stone structure. The turning point came late in the afternoon with the arrival of detachment soldiers from the French Guard who had sided with the people. They brought with them heavy artillery pieces seized earlier that morning. Setting up the cannons directly opposite the main inner drawbridge, the artillery commander aimed the heavy barrels at the wooden gate. Facing imminent destruction and seeing that his garrison was outnumbered, Governor de Launay realized that further resistance was impossible. At around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the defenders lowered the main drawbridge. The crowd poured into the Bastille. The symbolic fortress of royal absolutism had fallen not to a rival foreign army, but to the ordinary citizens of Paris. The capture of the Bastille sent shockwaves across Europe. When news reached the Palace of Versailles late that night, King Louis XVI was awakened from his sleep by one of his trusted advisors, the Duke of La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. Surprised by the news, the king reportedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" The Duke famously replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution." The storming of the Bastille was far more than a practical victory for gunpowder, it was a profound psychological turning point. It demonstrated that the absolute authority of the monarchy had broken. Power was shifting decisively into the hands of the people and their elected representatives. Recognizing the new reality, Louis XVI visited Paris a few days later. At the City Hall, he accepted a new emblem from the newly appointed mayor, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and the head of the National Guard, the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of the American War of Independence. The emblem was a cockade, a decorative ribbon combining the traditional red and blue colors of Paris with the white of the Bourbon monarchy. This tricolor, blue, white, and red, would become the enduring flag of modern France, symbolizing the union of the city and the state under the principles of liberty. While Paris celebrated, the spirit of revolution spread like wildfire into the countryside. A period known as the Great Fear swept through rural provinces during late July and August. Rumors circulated from village to village that panic-stricken nobles were hiring bands of brigands to destroy crops and crush the peasantry. Driven by fear and decades of stored resentment, peasants across France took matters into their own hands. They marched on the chateaux of their local lords, demanding the surrender of ancient feudal deeds and tax ledgers. When noblemen refused, rural manor houses were set alight, and the paper records of feudal servitude were burned in central village squares. Realizing that the country was sliding into total chaos, the National Assembly took dramatic action. On the night of August 4, 1789, in an extraordinary, emotional session that lasted until the early hours of the morning, noble delegates stood up one by one to voluntarily renounce their ancient feudal privileges. They gave up their exclusive hunting rights, their tax exemptions, and their legal authority over peasants. In a single night, centuries of feudal structure were swept away. 3 weeks later, on August 26, 1789, the National Assembly published its defining ideological document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Drafted with the help of the Marquis de Lafayette and inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment and the American Declaration of Independence, this noble manifesto declared that all men are born free and equal in rights. It guaranteed liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It established freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion, declaring that law must be the expression of the general will of the people. Its core motto echoed across the nation: Libet, Egalite, Fraternite, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. Yet, despite these historic legal achievements, the physical reality on the ground remained dire. The financial crisis was not solved overnight, and bread shortages continued to plague the cities. In early October 1789, rumors spread that a grand banquet had been held at Versailles, where royal officers had reportedly trampled upon the new tricolour cockade in a show of defiance against the revolution. At the same time, the price of bread in Paris spiked once again. On the rainy morning of October 5, market women in Paris had had enough. Gathering at the central markets, hundreds of women, sellers of fish, vegetables, and bread, began marching through the streets, beating drums and demanding food for their hungry children. As they marched, their numbers swelled into thousands. Joining forces with members of the National Guard, the vast procession set out on a 12-mile march through the mud toward Versailles. Arriving at the royal palace late in the afternoon, soaked and exhausted, a delegation of women was admitted to see the king. Louis XVI listened attentively and promised to release royal grain stores to feed the city. But for the crowd gathered outside, promises were no longer enough. Early the following morning, a group managed to enter the palace grounds through an unguarded gate. Tensions flared, and small skirmishes broke out between the crowd and the royal bodyguards inside the gilded corridors. Lafayette and the National Guard quickly restored order, but the crowd surrounding the palace had a clear, non-negotiable demand: the king and his family must leave the isolation of Versailles and return with them to Paris. Realizing he had no choice, Louis XVI appeared on the palace balcony alongside Queen Marie Antoinette and General Lafayette. The king announced that he would return to the capital. Later that afternoon, an extraordinary procession made its way along the muddy road from Versailles to Paris. At the front marched the market women, chanting and holding branches of olive trees, followed by wagons loaded with flour. In the center traveled the royal carriage, carrying King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their children, escorted by the National Guard and surrounded by thousands of cheering citizens. The royal family was relocated to the Tuileries Palace, an ancient residence situated in the center of Paris. The National Assembly followed soon after, setting up its meeting hall nearby. The king was no longer remote at Versailles, surrounded by courtiers and insulated from reality. He was now living in the middle of his bustling capital, under the watchful eyes of his people. The old order had officially crumbled, and the stage was set for a brand new society to be built upon its ruins. Yet, as the high emotion of 1789 began to settle into the complex work of governing, profound questions remained unanswered. Could a constitutional monarchy truly function with a king who secretly yearned for his lost absolute authority? How far would the Assembly go in remaking French society, culture, and religion? And how would the monarchies of Europe react as they watched the flame of revolution grow brighter and hotter in the heart of the continent? The initial sparks of rebellion had lit the sky, but the storm was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. 2. The fall of the crown. By the spring of 1790, a delicate, uneasy calm had settled over Paris. To a visitor walking through the Tuileries gardens, France appeared to be successfully navigating its grand transformation. King Louis XVI remained on the throne, but he was now a constitutional monarch, sharing power with the National Assembly. In July 1790, thousands gathered at the Champ de Mars for the Fête de la Fédération to celebrate the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Flags fluttered, bands played, and the king himself stood before a roaring crowd of over 300,000 citizens to swear an oath to uphold the upcoming constitution. Beside him, Marie Antoinette held up the young Dauphin to wild applause. For a brief moment, it seemed the revolution had achieved its ultimate goal, a united nation under liberty and law. Yet beneath this glittering display of national unity, deep tectonic fault lines were fracturing the country. The National Assembly faced a monumental task. It was not merely reforming government institutions, it was rebuilding French society from the ground up. To solve the nation's lingering financial debt, the Assembly made a drastic and controversial decision in late 1789. It confiscated all property owned by the Roman Catholic Church. These vast lands were used to back a new paper currency called assignats. Soon after, in July 1790, the Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. This legislation turned Catholic priests and bishops into paid state employees, elected by their parishioners, and required them to swear a primary oath of loyalty to the French state rather than to the Pope in Rome. This move deeply divided the nation. Catholicism was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, particularly in rural villages across the provinces. When Pope Pius VI condemned the law, thousands of devout priests refused to take the oath. France split overnight into two camps: constitutional priests who supported the revolution, and refractory priests who remained loyal to Rome. For millions of deeply religious peasants, forcing their local priests out was a line crossed. The revolution, which had initially brought hope of relief from feudal taxes, now felt like an assault on their faith. Inside the Tuileries Palace, King Louis XVI was experiencing his own profound moral crisis. As a devout Catholic, signing the civil constitution of the clergy weighed heavily on his conscience. He felt increasingly trapped, a virtual prisoner of the Assembly and the suspicious Paris public. His real authority was eroding daily. His royal guards had been replaced by Lafayette's National Guard, and conservative advisers whispered in his ear that the Assembly would never stop stripping away his ancestral rights. Queen Marie Antoinette, even more than her husband, was convinced that compromise with the revolutionaries was impossible. She maintained secret correspondence with her brother, Leopold II, the Holy Roman Emperor, as well as with royalist emigrants who had fled France and were assembling small armies along the eastern border. They urged the royal family to escape the capital and seek refuge in a loyalist military stronghold, where Louis could rally troops, regain his bargaining power, or invite foreign intervention to restore his absolute authority. For months, a quiet, dangerous plot was crafted. The mastermind behind the logistics was Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman and devoted ally of the Queen. Fersen arranged for a large, comfortable carriage, a heavy berlin, to be custom-built, bought forged passports, and mapped out a escape route toward the northeastern fortress town of Montmedy, near the border of the Austrian Netherlands. On the dark, quiet night of June 20, 1791, the plot was set in motion. Disguised as servants and a wealthy Russian baroness traveling with her children, the royal family slipped out of the Tuileries Palace through a side door, dodging the National Guard patrols. Count Fersen personally drove the family through the quiet streets of Paris in a small hackney carriage before transferring them to the larger berlin waiting outside the city gates. By midnight, the royal family was rolling eastward through the countryside under the cover of darkness. The escape had succeeded, or so it seemed. The escape plan relied on precise timing, as loyal cavalry detachments were posted at key towns along the route to escort the royal carriage to safety. But the heavy berlin moved far slower than expected. Delays accumulated hour by hour. When the royal carriage failed to arrive on schedule at the designated rendezvous points, the waiting cavalry units grew nervous under the suspicious gazes of local townspeople and eventually withdrew. Back in Paris, the morning of June 21 brought absolute chaos. When guards discovered the king's empty bedroom, alarm bells rang across the city. The National Assembly immediately dispatched couriers on horseback along every major road out of the capital, carrying orders to arrest the fleeing monarch. By late evening, the royal carriage reached the small town of Varennes-en-Argonne, just 30 miles from their ultimate destination. Stopping to change horses, the king stepped out briefly or poked his head out the window. A local postmaster named John Baptiste Drouet recognized the passenger. He had seen the king's image printed on a paper assignat note. Acting quickly, Drouet rode ahead into town, alerted the local authorities, and helped block the narrow bridge over the River Aire with heavy wagons. When the royal carriage attempted to cross, it was halted by the local militia. The town's mayor questioned the travelers, inspected their passports, and escorted them into a nearby house. Realizing the game was up, Louis XVI finally admitted his identity, appealing to the townsfolk for safe passage. It was too late. Couriers from the National Assembly arrived shortly after with explicit orders to return the king to Paris. The journey back to the capital was a long, painful ordeal. For 3 days, under a scorching summer sun, the heavy carriage was surrounded by thousands of armed citizens and National Guardsmen lined the roads. Unlike the Grand Parade of 1789, there were no cheers, no shouts of "Long live the King." Instead, the crowds watched in heavy, icy silence. The National Assembly had issued strict instructions: whoever applauds the king shall be beaten, whoever insults him shall be hanged. On June 25, the procession entered Paris. The flight to Varennes shattered the delicate illusion of the constitutional monarchy. Before leaving, Louis had left behind a signed manifesto explicitly rejecting the core reforms of the revolution, condemning the National Assembly, and rescinding his previous oaths. To the French public, the king's secret departure felt like a deep betrayal. He was no longer seen as a benevolent father of the nation, but as a traitor who had attempted to join foreign armies to wage war against his own people. The event sparked an intense debate within the revolutionary government. Moderate factions, led by figures like the Marquis de Lafayette and Antoine Barnave, feared that removing the king would plunge the nation into total chaos and invite immediate foreign invasion. They crafted an official story that the king had not fled voluntarily, but had been abducted by counter-revolutionary plotters. Radical political clubs, however, rejected this explanation with fury. At the forefront of this radicalization was the Cordeliers Club, led by fiery, charismatic speakers like Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat. They argued that Louis XVI had abdicated his throne by fleeing and demanded that France officially abolish the monarchy and declare a republic. On July 17, 1791, thousands of Parisians gathered at the Champ de Mars to sign a public petition demanding the removal of the king. As the crowd grew larger and more vocal, the mayor of Paris declared martial law. Lafayette arrived with units of the National Guard to disperse the gathering. High tensions quickly boiled over, stones were thrown, and the guard opened fire into the crowd. Dozens of citizens were killed in what became known as the Champ de Mars massacre. The bloodshed shattered the unity of the revolutionary movement. The moderate faction, known as the Feuillants, tried desperately to preserve the constitutional monarchy, while the radical left, increasingly dominated by the Jacobin Club, gained ground among the working-class citizens of Paris, known as the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes, literally meaning without knee breeches, were the artisans, shopkeepers, cobblers, and seamstresses of the urban neighborhoods. Unlike the wealthy bourgeoisie who wore aristocratic knee breeches, culottes, the working people wore long trousers, simple jackets, and the red liberty cap, bonnet rouge. They were driven by passion, a demand for affordable food, and a fierce commitment to direct democracy. They would soon become the muscle and momentum of the revolution. While internal strife tore through Paris, the international situation was rapidly deteriorating. European monarchs watched the events in France with growing horror. They worried that the revolutionary ideology, challenging the divine right of kings, would spread into their own territories. In August 1791, the rulers of Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. It declared that the restoration of order and monarchy in France was a matter of common interest for all European sovereigns, warning that they were prepared to use military force if necessary. Rather than intimidating the French people, the declaration sparked a wave of intense national pride and militarism. Inside the newly elected Legislative Assembly, a political faction known as the Girondins began loudly advocating for war. Led by the eloquent orator Jacques-Pierre Brisset, the Girondins believed that a war against foreign despots would unite the French nation, test the king's true loyalty, and spread the ideals of liberty across Europe. Surprisingly, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette also quietly supported the war effort, but for the exact opposite reason. They secretly believed France's disorganized armies would lose, allowing foreign troops to enter Paris and restore absolute royal authority. Only a few isolated voices spoke out against the war. Inside the Jacobin Club, a brilliant, austere lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre passionately warned against the rush to battle. No one loves armed missionaries, Robespierre argued, pointing out that war would drain the nation's resources and potentially pave the way for a military dictatorship. His warnings went unheeded. On April 20, 1792, France officially declared war on Austria. Prussia joined the war against France shortly after. The conflict began disastrously for France. Decades of discipline had been broken by the revolution, many noble military officers had emigrated, and the troops lacked proper training, supplies, and leadership. As Austrian and Prussian forces advanced steadily across the eastern border, panic swept through Paris. Every defeat was viewed not as a tactical error but as evidence of treason at the highest levels of government. Suspicion swirled around Queen Marie Antoinette, who was openly accused of passing military secrets to her Austrian relatives. In July 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared the country to be in danger, la patrie en danger, calling on volunteers from every province to march to the capital and defend the nation. Thousands of young men answered the call. Among them were volunteers from the southern city of Marseille. As they marched hundreds of miles across France toward Paris, they sang a fierce, spirited new war song written by an army officer named Rouget de Lisle. The song, filled with passionate calls to defend liberty against tyrants, caught the imagination of the entire nation. It became known as La Marseillaise, and would eventually become the national anthem of France. As the foreign armies closed in, the commander-in-chief of the allied Prussian and Austrian forces, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a fateful decree known as the Brunswick Manifesto. Published in Paris on August 1, 1792, the manifesto warned that if the Tuileries Palace was attacked, or if the king and queen were harmed in any way, the Allied armies would inflict an exemplary and unforgettable vengeance upon the city of Paris, reducing it to military destruction. The Brunswick Manifesto was intended to terrify the citizens of Paris into submission. Instead, it produced immediate, explosive fury. To the sans-culottes and the radical Jacobins, it was the final, irrefutable proof that Louis XVI was in direct league with the foreign invaders who were coming to crush their freedom. The reaction was swift and organized. Radical leaders in Paris formed a revolutionary municipal government known as the Paris Commune. On the night of August 9, church bells, the tocsin, rang out across the capital, signaling a general uprising. At dawn on August 10, 1792, a vast force composed of thousands of armed sans-culottes and volunteer soldiers from Marseille and Brittany marched toward the Tuileries Palace. The king was protected by a garrison of roughly 900 Swiss guards, elite, disciplined professional soldiers, alongside a few hundred loyal National Guardsmen. Realizing the immense size of the approaching crowd, Louis XVI was persuaded by advisors to abandon the palace and seek refuge with his family inside the nearby Legislative Assembly building. Shortly after the king's departure, the crowd surged into the palace courtyards. What began as a tense standoff quickly erupted into a furious battle. The Swiss guards fought with incredible bravery and discipline, holding the heavy stone staircases and firing down into the advancing crowds. For hours, musket smoke filled the magnificent halls of the palace, and the sound of heavy cannon fire echoed across the Seine. However, outmatched in numbers and gradually running low on ammunition, the defenders were overwhelmed as more armed citizens joined the assault. The Tuileries Palace was stormed and captured by the people. The insurrection of August 10 was a profound turning point. The Legislative Assembly, completely at the mercy of the victorious armed crowd, voted to suspend the king from his duties immediately. The royal family was taken into custody and imprisoned in the gloomy, medieval stone towers of the Temple, a fortified monastery in Paris. The 1,000-year-old French monarchy had officially fallen. With the king imprisoned and the enemy armies advancing ever closer, a dark wave of fear and paranoia gripped the capital. In late August, news arrived that the crucial border fortress of Verdun, the last major defensive barrier protecting the road to Paris, was under siege and about to fall to the Prussians. Panic reached a fever pitch. Revolutionary leaders, particularly Jean-Paul Marat, warned through his popular newspaper that while the city's young men marched off to the front lines, political prisoners and royalist sympathizers held in the city's overcrowded jails would break out and turn on the vulnerable citizens left behind. Between September 2 and September 7, 1792, a terrible collective madness seized the city. Crowds formed around Paris's major prisons, including the Abbaye, La Force, and the Conciergerie. Over 6 days, makeshift public tribunals were set up inside the courtyard gates. In a tragic rush of paranoia, over 1,200 prisoners, including non-arraying priests, political suspects, noblemen, and ordinary criminals, were summarily condemned and executed on the spot. The September massacres left an indelible stain on the revolution, shocking moderate politicians and alienating many supporters abroad. Yet, amid this dark chaos, the military tide suddenly turned. On September 20, 1792, near the small village of Valmy in northeastern France, the ill-trained, desperate French army faced the formidable, battle-hardened Prussian army. As a thick autumn fog lifted over the muddy landscape, a massive artillery duel began. The Prussian commanders expected the inexperienced French forces to break and flee under heavy fire. But the French artillery, led by professional officers who had remained loyal to the state, fired back with deadly precision. Standing their ground under heavy bombardment, the French infantry raised their hats on their bayonets and shouted with legendary defiance, "Vive la nation!" Surprised by the unexpected resolve of the French troops and suffering from illness and supply shortages, the Prussian commander ordered a retreat. The Battle of Valmy was not a massive bloody encounter, but its political psychological impact was immense. The Revolutionary Army had proven that it could stand and win against the finest professional armies in Europe. Standing among the German officers observing the battle at Valmy was the famous writer and philosopher Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Recognizing the historic importance of the moment, Goethe famously remarked to his companions, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world." He was right. 2 days later, on September 22, 1792, the newly elected National Convention, a National Assembly elected by universal male suffrage, met in Paris. In its very first session, the convention officially decreed the abolition of the monarchy. France was declared a republic. A new calendar was created to mark this milestone, resetting time itself. Year I of the French Republic had begun. With the monarchy gone, the National Convention had to decide what to do with the man who was now simply called Citizen Louis Capet. A fierce political battle erupted within the convention between two main factions. The Girondins, holding moderate views, argued against an immediate execution. They feared that killing the king would provoke a civil war inside France and unite all of Europe in a crusade to destroy the Republic. They suggested keeping Louis imprisoned as a political hostage or exiling him after the war ended. Opposing them were the Montagnards, the Mountain, the radical Jacobin faction led by Robespierre, Danton, and Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. They sat on the highest benches on the left side of the Assembly Hall. The Montagnards argued that as long as the king lived, he would remain a rallying point for counter-revolution. Saint-Just delivered a famous, chilling argument to the Assembly: Louis cannot be judged, he is already judged. He is condemned, or the Republic is not absolved. One cannot reign innocently. Robespierre echoed these sentiments, stating simply, Louis must die so that the nation may live. In November, a secret iron chest was discovered hidden inside a wall at the Tuileries Palace. It contained documents and correspondence proving that Louis XVI had maintained secret communications with foreign enemies and royalist emigrants. The discovery sealed his fate. The king was put on trial before the National Convention, accused of high treason against the French nation. Louis faced his accusers with quiet dignity, defending his actions and denying that he had ever intended to shed the blood of his people. But the outcome was all but inevitable. In January 1793, the National Convention voted on the verdict. By an overwhelming majority, citizen Louis Capet was found guilty of treason. A second vote was held to determine his sentence. By a narrow majority, the Assembly voted for his immediate execution. On the cold, foggy morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was driven in a green carriage through the silent streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV. Over 20,000 citizens had gathered in the wide square. A new instrument of execution stood in the center of the plaza, the guillotine. Designed by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin and built as a humane, efficient, and egalitarian method of execution, it ensured that all citizens, regardless of rank, faced the same swift legal fate. Louis XVI climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold with a firm step. He turned to the vast crowd and spoke his final words, his voice ringing out clearly over the drums. "People, I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon the authors of my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never fall upon France." Before he could say more, the drum rolls drowned out his voice. He was led to the machine, and the heavy iron blade fell. The execution of the king sent shockwaves across the globe. The ancient link between divine right monarchy and European society was broken forever. The French Republic had thrown down a decisive gauntlet to the crowned heads of Europe. In response, Britain, Spain, Holland, and several Italian states joined Austria and Prussia in a grand coalition against France. At the same time, massive royalist and Catholic uprisings erupted across the French provinces, most notably in the western region of the Vendée. Surrounded by foreign armies on every border and torn apart by civil war within, the young French Republic was facing imminent collapse. To survive the coming storm, the revolution would have to abandon its noble constitutional ideals and embrace a period of unprecedented intensity, discipline, and terror. And amid the chaos of a nation fighting for its very life, a young, brilliant artillery officer from the island of Corsica was quietly waiting for his chance to step onto the grand stage of history. 3. The Shadow of the Terror. By the spring of 1793, the young French Republic was facing mortal danger from every direction. The execution of Louis XVI had ignited a firestorm across Europe. Great Britain, Spain, Holland, and a dozen German and Italian states joined Austria and Prussia in a massive, hostile alliance known as the First Coalition. On every frontier, royal armies were pushing back French forces, threatening to breach the borders and march directly on Paris. Inside France, the situation was equally desperate. In the western province of the Vendée, a massive counter-revolutionary revolt had erupted. Deeply attached to their Catholic faith and their local priests, tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and local nobles formed the Royal and Catholic Army. Armed with hunting rifles, scythes, and captured cannons, they rose up in direct rebellion against the central government in Paris, refusing to be drafted into a military they did not support. Soon, similar anti-government uprisings flared up in major southern cities like Lyon, Marseille, Toulouse, and Toulon. To make matters worse, hyperinflation was destroying the economy. The value of the paper assignat collapsed, bread was scarce, and food riots broke out daily across the working-class neighborhoods of Paris. The National Convention, the governing body of the Republic, was locked in bitter internal warfare between the moderate Girondins and the radical Montagnards. The Girondins accused the radicals of steering the country toward lawlessness, while the Montagnards accused the Girondins of weak leadership, elitism, and soft-heartedness in the face of national ruin. In late May 1793, The impasse was broken by the streets. Thousands of armed sans-culottes, encouraged by radical journalists and the Paris Commune, surrounded the National Convention with cannons pointed at its doors. They demanded the arrest of the leading Girondin deputies. Overwhelmed and intimidated, the convention capitulated. On June 2, 29 prominent Girondin leaders were arrested, leaving the radical Montagnards in absolute control of the government. Faced with foreign invasion, civil war, and economic collapse, the convention took extraordinary measures. It suspended the new democratic constitution and declared that the government would remain revolutionary until the peace. To exercise day-to-day executive authority, the convention delegated immense power to a small, 12-man cabinet, the Committee of Public Safety. Initially dominated by the fiery, roaring orator Georges Danton, the committee was soon led by a man of very different temperament, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was a provincial lawyer from Arras who had earned the nickname the Incorruptible for his flawless personal morals, modest lifestyle, and absolute devotion to the revolution. Thin, pale, immaculate in his powdered wig and sky-blue coat, Robespierre was not driven by personal ambition or wealth, but by a fanatic belief in the political philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He envisioned a republic of virtue, a society where civic duty, equality, and devotion to the common good replaced all self-interest. To achieve this virtuous utopia during a time of existential crisis, Robespierre believed that idealism alone was insufficient. In a famous speech, he declared his core philosophy: if the spring of popular government in time of peace is virtue, the springs of popular government in revolution are at once virtue and terror, virtue, without which terror is fatal, terror, without which virtue is impotent. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. Alongside Robespierre served his young, brilliant, and ruthlessly efficient ally, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. At just 25 years old, Saint-Just was known as the Angel of Death for his cold eloquence and unwavering conviction that any sacrifice was justified to protect the Republic. The Committee of Public Safety assumed near-dictatorial powers over French life, transforming the nation into a fully mobilized war state. To tackle the military threat, the committee appointed a brilliant engineer and military strategist named Lazarus Carnot as Minister of War. In August 1793, Carnot drafted the famous Levée en masse, mass conscription decree. It was a revolutionary concept. For the first time in modern history, an entire nation was mobilized for war. The decree laid out the duties of every citizen with absolute clarity. Unmarried young men were drafted into the army, married men were tasked with forging weapons and manufacturing gunpowder in state workshops, women worked in hospitals and made uniforms and tents, children scraped old linens to make bandages, and older men gathered in public squares to boost morale and preach unity. Almost overnight, France raised an unprecedented army of nearly 800,000 men. It was not an army of professional mercenaries serving a king, but a citizen army fighting for their own land, rights, and ideology. Under Carnot's energetic organization, new military tactics were developed: massive, aggressive column attacks, the slow, formal line formations of traditional 18th-century warfare. To control the domestic crisis and stamp out counter-revolution, the revolutionary government established the machinery of the Reign of Terror. In September 1793, the convention passed the Law of Suspects. This sweeping law defined suspects in extraordinarily vague terms: anyone who by their conduct, associations, talk, or writings showed themselves to be enemies of liberty. Local revolutionary surveillance committees were set up in every neighborhood and village to compile lists of suspects and issue arrest warrants. Those accused were sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris, presided over by the relentless prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville. In its early months, the tribunal observed basic legal procedures, but as the terror intensified, trials became brief, symbolic affairs where defense witnesses were banned and the only two possible verdicts were acquittal or death. Every morning, heavy wooden carts called tumbrils rattled over the cobblestones of Paris, carrying the condemned to the Place de la Révolution. The blade of the guillotine rose and fell with relentless frequency. Among its high-profile victims was the former Queen, Marie Antoinette. Put on trial in October 1793, physically broken and prematurely aged by months of harsh imprisonment, she bore the venomous accusations of the court with quiet, dignified composure. On October 16, her hair cut short and her hands bound behind her back, she was executed before a hostile crowd. 2 weeks later, 21 of the arrested Girondin leaders walked up the steps of the scaffold together, singing La Marseillaise in unison until the final voice was silenced. Thousands of ordinary citizens followed, merchants accused of hoarding grain, aristocrats who had failed to flee, journalists, and peasants caught on the wrong side of local political disputes. Beyond Paris, the terror raged with terrifying violence in the regions that had rebelled against the Republic. In the city of Lyon, which had staged an armed revolt against the Jacobins, the National Convention ordered a brutal retribution. Heavy artillery was used to demolish parts of the city, and hundreds of rebels were executed en masse in open fields. In Nantes, to speed up executions, a ruthless deputy named Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised a horrific method known as the noyades, drownings, where hundreds of prisoners were bound together and placed on barges that were deliberately sunk in the Loire River. In the western provinces of the Vendée, the conflict degenerated into a brutal, total civil war. Revolutionary infernal columns marched through the countryside, burning villages and farms to break the back of the royalist insurgency. The human cost was staggering, tens of thousands perished on both sides before the region was subdued. Yet, amid this dark ocean of coercion and violence, the committee's radical measures achieved their immediate purpose: the Republic survived. The citizen armies raised by the Levée en masse began pushing back the Allied forces across every front. At the Battle of Hondschoote and the Battle of Wattignies, French armies drove the British and Austrians back into Flanders. The domestic rebellions in Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux were systematically crushed. However, one major strategic threat remained in the south, the vital naval port of Toulon. In August 1793, royalist leaders in Toulon had handed control of the city, its formidable harbor, and 30 ships of the French Mediterranean fleet over to a combined Anglo-Spanish force. British troops occupied the high forts surrounding the bay, turning Toulon into an impregnable Allied base in southern France. Losing Toulon meant losing control of the Mediterranean and inviting a permanent enemy stronghold on French soil. The National Convention dispatched a large army to besiege the city, but early efforts were paralyzed by incompetent political appointees commanding the artillery. In September, the siege's original artillery commander was wounded in action. Searching for a replacement, an influential political deputy from Corsica named Antoine Salicetti recommended a 24-year-old artillery captain who happened to be nearby. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica, to a family of minor Italian nobility, Napoleon had grown up as an outsider. Corsica had been annexed by France just a year before his birth. As a boy, Napoleon was sent to military schools in mainland France, including the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. Short, quiet, with an intense gaze and a pronounced Italian accent, he was often teased by his wealthier French classmates. He took refuge in intense study, devouring books on ancient history, military strategy, mathematics, and geography. He was particularly fascinated by the conquests of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and the military theories of the French artillery reformer Jean-Baptiste de Greboval. When the revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon was a young, ambitious artillery lieutenant. He embraced the revolutionary movement enthusiastically, seeing it as a meritocracy that broke down aristocratic privilege and opened doors for talented individuals who lacked noble blood or court connections. When Captain Napoleon arrived at the siege of Toulon in the autumn of 1793, he immediately recognized the strategic key to the entire operation. The High Command was planning a slow, costly ground assault on the heavily fortified landward walls of the city. Napoleon realized this was a fundamental mistake. Looking at a map of the harbor, he identified a specific promontory called L'Iguillette, situated on the heights overlooking the inner and outer roadsteads of the bay. Napoleon argued that if French forces could capture Liguillet and position heavy siege guns there, they could rain direct artillery fire down upon the British and Spanish ships anchored in the harbor below. Starved of naval support and facing the destruction of their fleet, the Allied evacuation of Toulon would become inevitable. The senior generals initially dismissed the young captain's plan, but Napoleon was relentless. He used his connections with Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre, who was serving as a political commissioner at the siege, to push his strategy directly to the government in Paris. Recognizing the young officer's extraordinary tactical brilliance, the committee backed Napoleon, promoting him to major and then lieutenant colonel of artillery. Napoleon immediately set to work with terrifying energy. He requisitioned abandoned cannons from nearby coastal forts, repaired broken equipment, established a dedicated foundry to cast shot, and trained raw civilian recruits into disciplined, expert gunners. He personally worked alongside his men in the mud, sleeping in a simple cloak beside his batteries. To inspire his men to hold a particularly dangerous artillery position directly exposed to enemy fire, he erected a sign over the battery reading, "The Battery of the Fearless Men." Volunteers rushed to crew it. On the dark, stormy night of December 16, 1793, the decisive assault began. Under a heavy downpour of rain, French troops launched a fierce attack on Fort Mulgrave, a formidable British stronghold built on the heights of Liguillet. Napoleon was in the thick of the action. Leading an artillery column through the mud, his horse was shot beneath him, and he received a deep bayonet wound to his thigh. Despite the painful injury, he pressed forward until the fort was captured. By morning, Napoleon had successfully mounted heavy siege cannons on the heights of Liguillet, pointing directly down at the enemy fleet. Just as Napoleon had predicted, the British commander realized his position was completely untenable. On the night of December 18, under the protective fire of their remaining warships, the British and Spanish forces began a hurried, frantic evacuation of Toulon, setting fire to the French arsenal and remaining ships as they fled. On December 19, French troops marched victorious into Toulon. The siege of Toulon was a sensational triumph for the young republic, and it catapulted Napoleon Bonaparte from complete obscurity into national prominence. At just 24 years old, he was promoted to the rank of brigadier general. Augustin Robespierre wrote to his brother in Paris, praising the young Corsican officer as a military genius of extraordinary ability. While Napoleon's star was rising in the south, back in Paris, the reign of terror was reaching its tragic, feverish peak. By early 1794, the extreme political violence had begun to turn inward, devouring the very leaders who had built the system. Paranoia inside the government was absolute. Anyone who suggested slowing down the terror was suspected of treason, while anyone who advocated for even more extreme violence was suspected of trying to destroy the government through chaos. First, Robespierre targeted the radical left faction led by Jacques Hébert, who called for de-Christianization, the closing of all churches, and unlimited executions. In March 1794, Hébert and his followers were sent to the guillotine. Next, Robespierre turned on his former friend and ally, the legendary orator Georges Danton. Danton, seeing that the military victories had saved the Republic, argued that it was time to end the terror, restore legal protections, and show mercy to political opponents. Robespierre viewed Danton's calls for mercy as a dangerous betrayal of revolutionary purity. In April 1794, Danton, along with the brilliant journalist Camille Desmoulins, was arrested, tried in a rigged hearing, and condemned to death. Standing on the scaffold before the guillotine, the tall, imposing Danton turned to the executioner, Charles Henri Sanson, and uttered his famous final words, "Show my head to the people." It is well worth seeing. With Danton dead and all political opposition silenced, Robespierre possessed absolute power. In June 1794, he introduced the draconian law of 22 prairial. This law stripped accused persons of their right to counsel, eliminated defense witnesses, and made death the mandatory punishment for all offenses under the tribunal's jurisdiction. During the 6 weeks that followed, a period known as the Great Terror, more people were guillotined in Paris than during the entire preceding year. Over 1,400 people were executed in 46 days. The wooden scaffold ran red with blood, and a heavy, suffocating cloud of dread hung over the capital. Robespierre's ultimate vision was not merely political control, but a complete moral revolution. He attempted to replace traditional Christianity with a state-sponsored, secular religion called the cult of the Supreme Being. On June 8, 1794, Robespierre organized a massive, bizarre festival in Paris to inaugurate the new cult. Dressed in his signature sky-blue coat and holding a bouquet of flowers and wheat, Robespierre walked at the front of a grand procession to the Champ de Mars, where a huge artificial mountain had been constructed. He climbed to the top of the mountain to deliver a sermon on virtue and morality. To many deputies watching from the crowd, this spectacle was the final straw. They saw Robespierre no longer as a defender of liberty, but as a delusional, messianic dictator who was preparing to purge the assembly once again. Fear did what politics could not. It united the surviving deputies of the National Convention in a desperate, secret plot to save their own lives. The climax arrived on 8 Thermidor, July 26, 1794, according to the revolutionary calendar. Robespierre stood before the National Convention and delivered a long, threatening speech. He announced that a new list of traitors existed among the deputies and government ministers, but he refused to name the individuals. This was a fatal political mistake. Every single deputy in the room believed that his own name was on the secret list. If they did not strike Robespierre immediately, they would be sent to the guillotine tomorrow. The following morning, 9 Thermidor, July 27, Robespierre and Saint-Just returned to the hall. When Saint-Just stood up to speak, he was drowned out by unified shouts from the floor, "Down with the tyrant! Down with the dictator!" Robespierre rushed to the rostrum, attempting to speak, but his voice cracked under the deafening noise of banging desks and shouting deputies. A deputy famously yelled, "The blood of Danton chokes him." By official vote of the National Convention, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Augustin Robespierre, and their close allies were declared outlawed and ordered under arrest. That night, loyal troops from the Paris Commune rescued Robespierre and brought him to the City Hall, Hôtel de Ville, to organize a counter-insurrection. But the energy of the radical streets had been exhausted by months of blood and fear. In the early hours of the morning on July 28, troops loyal to the convention stormed the City Hall. In the violent confusion, a pistol shot echoed through the room, shattering Robespierre's jaw. Lying bleeding on a wooden table inside the offices of the Committee of Public Safety, the broken architect of the terror spent his final hours surrounded by the mocking stares of his political enemies. Late that afternoon, July 28, 1794, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and 20 of their allies were taken to the Place de la Révolution. As the blade of the guillotine fell on Robespierre, a massive cheer of relief erupted from the vast crowd gathering in the square. The Thermidorian reaction had begun. The reign of terror was officially over. In the months that followed, the machinery of repression was dismantled, the Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its absolute power, the law of suspects was repealed, the Revolutionary Tribunal was abolished, and hundreds of political prisoners were released from jail. France breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nation was desperate for stability, peace, and order after years of unprecedented ideological fever. However, the fall of Robespierre left behind a political vacuum, an exhausted economy, and a deeply divided society. The Jacobin radical movement was crushed, but royalists saw an opportunity to restore the old monarchy, while the starving urban poor still demanded bread and direct democracy. To navigate this delicate path between royalist reaction and radical Jacobinism, a new government was formed in 1795, the Directory. It was a conservative, moderate republic led by a 5-man executive council and a 2-chamber parliament. But the Directory was weak, notoriously corrupt, and deeply unpopular. It relied heavily on military force to crush domestic revolts from both the left and the right. And as the political leaders in Paris stumbled and squabbled, the nation turned its eyes toward its victorious armies on the frontier, and toward one young, ambitious general in particular, whose extraordinary journey was about to take him from the harbor of Toulon to the golden sands of Egypt and the very center of European power. For the rise of the young eagle. The summer of 1795 brought a fragile, flickering sense of quiet back to the streets of Paris. The reign of terror was dead, but the victory had left France thoroughly bruised and battered. The nation was like a patient recovering from a long, burning fever, pale, exhausted, and desperately yearning for normal life. In the cafes and public gardens, people gathered not to chant radical slogans, but to enjoy music, dance, and converse without the constant, terrifying fear of a knock at the door in the dead of night. Yet beneath this surface of collective relief, the political ground remained dangerously unstable. The new government, known as the Directory, took power in late 1795. Designed to prevent any single man or group from ever seizing total power again, executive authority was split among a council of 5 directors, supported by a 2-house parliament, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. While the Directory looked balanced on paper, in reality it was built on shaky sand. It was plagued by rampant financial corruption, wild inflation, and a complete lack of popular enthusiasm. The working-class citizens of Paris were bitter over rising bread prices and the loss of their political voice, while conservative royalists saw the government's weakness as their perfect invitation to bring back the Bourbon monarchy. In October 1795, the month of Vendémiaire in the revolutionary calendar, the brewing political storm finally erupted. Emboldened by electoral gains and supported by wealthy neighborhoods, over 30,000 royalist insurgents took up arms across Paris. Organized into well-disciplined National Guard units, the royalist forces marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the National Convention was meeting. Their goal was simple: overthrow the Republic and restore the crown. The Directory was in absolute panic. Against 30,000 armed insurgents, the government had only about 5,000 regular army troops available to defend the palace. The director tasked with defending the government, Paul Barras, realized he needed an aggressive, brilliant military officer who would not hesitate to take drastic action. Barras remembered the hero of Toulon, General Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was in Paris at that very moment, unemployed and living in a modest hotel room. After the fall of Robespierre, he had fallen out of favor due to his previous political ties to Robespierre's younger brother. Depressed, thin, and struggling to afford basic meals, the 26-year-old general had been spending his days reading in libraries and pacing the banks of the Seine, wondering if his military career was effectively over. When Barras summoned Napoleon on the night of October 4, 1795, and offered him command of the palace defenses, Napoleon did not hesitate. He grasped the tactical reality in an instant: if the royalists surrounded the Tuileries, the government would fall within hours. To win against overwhelming numerical odds, he needed artillery. Napoleon immediately dispatched a young, dashing cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to ride like the wind to the military camp at Sablons, 3 miles outside the city gates. Murat and his cavalry arrived just minutes before a royalist detachment reached the camp, securing 40 heavy cannons and hauling them back through the dark streets to the Tuileries Palace before dawn. Napoleon positioned the cannons at strategic choke points leading to the palace, loading the barrels with heavy lead iron balls wrapped in canvas, a brutal anti-personnel ammunition known as grapeshot. When fired, grapeshot turned a cannon into a massive, wall-scaling shotgun. On the afternoon of 13 Vendémiaire, October 5, 1795, the massive column of royalist insurgents advanced down the narrow streets toward the Tuileries. When they refused orders to disperse, Napoleon gave the command to fire. A deafening roar echoed off the stone buildings. The sudden, devastating blast of grapeshot tore through the front ranks of the advancing column. Thunderous salvo after salvo cleared the narrow street in minutes. Shocked by the unyielding firepower and the absolute resolve of the defender, the royalist forces broke ranks and fled in total panic. The battle was over in a matter of hours. Napoleon had saved the National Convention and preserved the French Republic. When asked about the event later, Napoleon remarked with his characteristic, icy coolness that he had swept away the rebellion with a whiff of grapeshot. Overnight, the neglected, impoverished Corsican general became a national celebrity. The Directory promoted Napoleon to commander of the Army of the Interior, granting him immense political influence, social access, and financial security. It was during this whirlwind of newfound success that Napoleon met the woman who would captivate his heart, Marie-Joseph Rose de la Pagerie, known to history as Josephine. Born in Martinique to a French sugar plantation family, Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon. She was a widow whose first husband, Viscount Alexandre de Beauharnais, had been guillotined during the Reign of Terror. Charming, elegant, and exceptionally skilled at navigating the sophisticated political salons of Paris, Josephine possessed a grace that completely dazzled the young, socially awkward general. Napoleon fell madly, intensely in love. He renamed her Josephine, a name he preferred over Rose, and bombarded her with passionate, poetic love letters daily. Though Josephine was initially more cautious, recognizing the young general's extraordinary ambition and rising influence, she accepted his proposal. On March 9, 1796, Napoleon and Josephine were married in a civil ceremony in Paris. Napoleon was so consumed by his military preparations that he arrived 2 hours late for his own wedding, having spent the afternoon staring at maps of northern Italy. Just 2 days after the wedding, Napoleon bade a painful farewell to his new bride and set out for his new command, the Army of Italy. The Italian campaign was considered a secondary theatre of war by the Directory. The main French effort against the First Coalition was supposed to be launched through southern Germany toward Vienna. The Army of Italy, stationed along the rugged coast of the Maritime Alps, was intended merely to distract Austrian forces. When Napoleon arrived at his headquarters in Nice in late March 1796, he found an army in a state of complete neglect. The 37,000 men under his command were poorly dressed, starving, unpaid for months, and lacking shoes, horses, and basic ammunition. Disease was rampant, and morale was rock bottom. Furthermore, the army's senior division generals, veterans like Pierre Augereau and André Massena, were deeply skeptical of their new commander. They saw Napoleon as a political favorite from Paris who had gained his command through smooth talking rather than battlefield experience. Napoleon quickly shattered their doubts. At his very first meeting with his generals, his fierce intensity, sharp intellect, and commanding presence established absolute authority. Massena later remarked, when he put on his general's hat, he seemed to grow by 2 feet. Napoleon then turned to his weary, underfed soldiers and delivered a thrilling proclamation that ignited their imaginations. Soldiers! You are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. Your patience and courage amidst these rocks are admirable, but they bring you no glory. I desire to lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, will you lack courage or constancy? Napoleon was about to revolutionize the art of war. In the late 18th century, European armies moved slowly, weighed down by massive supply trains, strict linear formations, and cautious aristocratic commanders who avoided taking major risks. Napoleon threw out these old rules. His strategy relied on speed, flexibility, and relentless aggression. He reorganized his force into independent army corps, miniature armies containing infantry, cavalry, and artillery that could march separately along parallel roads to move faster and live off the surrounding countryside, before rapidly concentrating together right before a battle. His core tactical doctrine was the strategy of the central position. When facing enemy forces that outnumbered him, Napoleon would drive his army like a sharp wedge directly between the enemy's divided columns, preventing them from joining forces. He would then throw his full weight against one isolated enemy wing, crush it quickly, and wheel around to destroy the other before it could react. In April 1796, Napoleon launched his campaign against the combined forces of the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont and the Austrian Empire. In an incredible two-week lightning offensive known as the Montenotte Campaign, Napoleon marched his starving troops over the snow-covered Alpine passes. Striking with terrifying speed, he defeated the Piedmontese forces in battle after battle, at Montenotte, Millesimo, and Mondovì. Stunned by the speed and violent intensity of the French advance, the King of Sardinia sued for peace, knocking Piedmont completely out of the war and ceding Savoy and Nice to France. In just 14 days, Napoleon had secured his flank, captured dozens of cannons, fully equipped his men with captured enemy supplies, and severed Austria's main ally in Italy. Turning his sights on the retreating Austrian army led by General Beaulieu, Napoleon pursued them across the fertile plains of Lombardy. On May 10, 1796, the French army encountered the Austrian rear guard at the town of Lodi. To cross the broad Adda River and continue the pursuit, the French had to cross a narrow, 200-yard wooden bridge defended by several thousand Austrian soldiers and a dozen heavy cannons pointed directly down the wooden planks. It was a terrifying defensive bottleneck. Many generals would have sought a detour, but Napoleon knew that taking Lodi by storm would break the spirit of the Austrian army. Napoleon personally helped position the French artillery along the riverbank to pour covering fire across the water. Then, gathering a dense column of elite French infantry, he shouted words of encouragement and ordered the assault. With bayonets fixed, the French column surged onto the narrow bridge, singing revolutionary songs. Austrian grapeshot tore through the front ranks, but the French soldiers pressed forward through the smoke, scrambling over fallen comrades. Sweeping across the bridge, they overwhelmed the enemy gunners in a ferocious hand-to-hand fight. The Battle of Lodi was a modest tactical victory, but its psychological impact was monumental. The sheer bravery of the action earned Napoleon the lifelong, affectionate devotion of his men. Impressed by their young commander's willingness to stand under heavy fire alongside them, the soldiers fondly gave him a famous nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. For Napoleon himself, Lodi was a moment of profound personal transformation. Years later, reflecting on that sunny May afternoon on the Adda River, he wrote, "It was only on the evening of Lodi that I realized I was a superior being, and that there rose within me the ambition to perform great deeds that up to then had occupied my mind only as a passing dream." 5 days after Lodi, on May 15, 1796, Napoleon rode victorious into the magnificent city of Milan under a shower of thrown flowers, welcomed by crowds who saw the French as liberators bringing freedom from Austrian absolute rule. However, the campaign was far from over. Austria was determined to reclaim Italy and dispatched its finest military commander, Field Marshal Dagobert von Wurmser, at the head of a fresh, battle-hardened army. The key to controlling northern Italy was the grand, heavily fortified city of Mantua. Situated on a peninsula surrounded by 3 natural lakes, Mantua was an almost impregnable fortress. Whoever held Mantua held the gateway to Central Europe and the Austrian capital of Vienna. Napoleon placed Mantua under siege, but over the next 8 months, the Austrian High Command sent for separate relief armies sweeping down through the Alpine valleys to crush the French and break the siege. What followed was a masterclass in operational military genius. Operating from his central position around Lake Garda, Napoleon raced back and forth across northern Italy, marching his troops to the absolute limits of physical human endurance. Time and time again, Napoleon struck the arriving Austrian columns before they could unite. At the Battle of Castiglione in August, Napoleon outmaneuvered Wurmser, forcing him to retreat. At the Battle of Bassano in September, he caught the Austrian army on the march, destroying its artillery trains and forcing Field Marshal Wurmser himself to flee inside the walls of Mantua, where he became trapped alongside the garrison he had come to rescue. By November 1796, a third Austrian relief force of 40,000 men arrived under the command of General Joseph Alvinci. The French army was exhausted, ragged, and outnumbered. Rain and freezing mud turned the roads into swamps. At the Battle of Arcalay, November 15 to 17, 1796, the two armies fought a desperate, three-day struggle among the muddy marshes of the Adige River. Once again, the key to the battle was a narrow wooden bridge crossing the Alpone River. Repeated French attempts to charge across the bridge were repulsed by intense Austrian musket fire. Seeing his men hesitate, the 27-year-old Napoleon grabbed a tricolour flag, ran to the front of the column, and rushed onto the exposed bridge, shouting, "Follow your general!" An Austrian salvo erupted. Napoleon's aide-de-camp, Jean-Baptiste Muiron, threw his body in front of Napoleon to protect him and was killed instantly. In the violent confusion that followed, Napoleon was knocked off the bridge, tumbling into the freezing, waist-deep mud of the marsh. Surrounded by enemy troops, he was saved only when his desperate soldiers charged into the swamp to haul their beloved commander back to safety. Inspired by his leadership, the French launched a fierce flank attack the following day, crossing the river on a makeshift pontoon bridge and routing Alvinci's forces. The final, decisive climax of the Italian campaign arrived in January 1797 on the windswept plateau of Rivoli. General Alvinci had launched a massive, multi-column attack designed to trap the French army against the steep cliffs overlooking the Adige River. Recognizing the terrain's strategic importance, Napoleon worked throughout the freezing night, personally riding along the front line to position his artillery and corps. When dawn broke on January 14, 1797, the Battle of Rivoli began. Napoleon allowed the main Austrian column to climb the narrow, steep roads onto the plateau. Just as they reached the top, Napoleon unleashed a devastating, coordinated counterattack. Heavy artillery opened fire at point-blank range while French cavalry led by General Kellerman charged down the slope, smashing the head of the Austrian column. The enemy ranks broke into total chaos, tumbling back down the steep ravine. Rivoli was an absolute, overwhelming victory. The Austrian army in Italy was shattered beyond repair. Less than 3 weeks later, on February 2, 1797, the starved, disease-ridden garrison at Mantua finally surrendered. Over 30,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their weapons. With northern Italy completely secured, Napoleon did not wait for orders from the Directory in Paris. He drove his victorious army directly over the snow-covered Austrian Alps, pushing deep into enemy territory until his forward vanguard was just 70 miles from the gates of Vienna. Panicked by the rapid approach of the invincible French general, the Austrian emperor sued for peace. Negotiating directly with Austrian diplomats at Campo Formio, Napoleon acted not as a simple general obeying a government, but as an independent sovereign ruler of a state. He redrew the map of Europe. Under the Treaty of Campo Formio, October 1797, Austria officially ceded the Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, and the left bank of the Rhine to France. Austria also recognized the creation of the Cisalpine Republic and the Ligurian Republic, new French-style sister republics established by Napoleon in northern Italy. In exchange, Austria received the ancient Republic of Venice. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as an undisputed national hero. Millions of citizens lined the streets to glimpse the young conqueror of Italy. The Directory hosted a grand, lavish reception in his honor at the Luxembourg Palace, but behind their forced smiles, the political leaders of Paris were quietly terrified of him. They saw that Napoleon possessed something no other politician had: the unconditional love of the army and the adoration of the French public. He had proved himself not only a tactical genius on the battlefield, but a brilliant administrator, diplomat, and propaganda master who published his own newspapers to celebrate his victories. The Directory wanted Napoleon as far away from Paris as possible. And Napoleon, recognizing that the political fruit in Paris was not yet ripe for picking, was looking toward a far grander, more romantic horizon. With Austria defeated, only one major enemy remained at war with the French Republic, Great Britain. Directly invading the British Isles across the stormy, Royal Navy-dominated English Channel was considered far too dangerous. Napoleon proposed a bold, audacious alternative strategic plan: an expedition to conquer Egypt. By seizing Egypt, then a province of the Ottoman Empire, France could establish a strategic stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean, cut off Britain's lucrative trade routes to India, and potentially open a gateway for French forces to link up with anti-British rulers in India like Tipu Sultan. Furthermore, Egypt held an irresistible, romantic appeal for Napoleon. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of his boyhood heroes, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He famously remarked, "Great reputations are made only in the East, Europe is a molehill." The Directory enthusiastically approved the risky plan, delighted by the prospect of sending the dangerous young general across the Mediterranean. In May 1798, a grand French armada set sail from Toulon under total secrecy. It consisted of over 300 transport ships escorted by 13 ships of the line, carrying 35,000 veteran troops. Crucially, alongside his soldiers and guns, Napoleon brought an extraordinary task force of over 150 top scientists, engineers, mathematicians, cartographers, and artists, known as the savants. They included brilliant minds like the mathematician Gaspard Monod and the chemist Claude-Louis Berthollet. Their mission was to study, map, and document every aspect of Egypt's geography, history, natural life, and ancient monuments. Sailing across the Mediterranean, Napoleon successfully evaded the British Mediterranean fleet under the command of the legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson. En route to Egypt, the French fleet made a sudden stop at the rocky island fortress of Malta. Held for centuries by the ancient military order of the Knights of St. John, the fortress was considered virtually impregnable. But through a combination of naval intimidation and internal political intrigue, Napoleon captured the island in 48 hours without losing a single man, seizing its rich treasury to finance his campaign. On July 1, 1798, the French armada arrived off the coast of Alexandria, Egypt. Landing his troops on the beaches at night in rough seas, Napoleon marched his forces straight across the desert toward Alexandria, capturing the ancient port city by storm the following morning. From Alexandria, Napoleon launched a brutal, 2-week march through the burning sands toward Cairo. The French soldiers, dressed in heavy wool uniforms and unaccustomed to the blistering desert heat, suffered immensely from dehydration, blindness caused by sandstorms, and constant harassment from nomadic Bedouin cavalry. Morale plummeted, but Napoleon kept his men moving forward along the banks of the Nile. On July 21, 1798, near the village of Imbabe, the French army rounded a bend in the river and saw a breathtaking sight. Rising out of the shimmering heat haze on the horizon were the colossal, ancient shapes of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Blocking their path to Cairo was the formidable army of the Mamluks. The Mamluks were a military caste of fierce warrior knights who had ruled Egypt for centuries. Mounted on fine Arabian horses and armed with gold-embossed pistols, Damascus steel scimitars, and heavy lances, they were considered some of the finest individual cavalry fighters in the world. Led by Murad Bey, over 10,000 Mamluk knights, supported by thousands of foot soldiers, drew up their lines across the desert plain. Napoleon drew up his veteran army into 5 massive, hollow infantry squares. Each square was a living fortress, 6 rows of disciplined soldiers facing outward with fixed bayonets, with artillery positioned at the corners and command staff, supplies, and the savants protected safely inside the center. Looking across the sand at his men, Napoleon pointed toward the ancient monuments looming in the distance and delivered one of the most famous speeches in military history. "Soldiers, forward! Remember that from the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history looked down upon you." The Battle of the Pyramids was an extraordinary clash of 2 completely different eras, medieval chivalry against modern European military discipline. With terrifying war cries, the Mamluk cavalry charged forward across the open desert. The ground shook under thousands of galloping hooves. But as the wall of armored horses and flashing scimitars approached the French formations, Napoleon held his fire until the enemy was just 50 yards away. A roaring wave of organized musket fire and grapeshot erupted from the French squares. The devastating volleys shattered the Mamluk charge. Time and time again, the Mamluk knights attempted to find a weak spot in the bristling hedge of bayonets, galloping around the squares under continuous, lethal fire. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. The Mamluk army was completely destroyed, losing thousands of men, while the French suffered fewer than 30 killed. 2 days later, Napoleon entered Cairo in triumph, establishing his headquarters in the palace of the fallen Mamluk ruler. Napoleon immediately set to work organizing the administration of Egypt, establishing modern hospitals, street lighting, postal systems, and street cleaning departments. He established the Institut d'Egypte, where his team of savants began their groundbreaking work, a research effort that would eventually yield the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, providing the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and birth the modern science of Egyptology. Napoleon attempted to win over the local Egyptian population, wearing traditional robes, attending religious festivals, and showing deep respect for Islamic scholars and the Quran. Yet, just as Napoleon reached the absolute height of his Oriental fantasy, disaster struck from the sea. On the afternoon of August 1, 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson's British fleet finally located the French armada anchored in a long, defensive line in Abuka Bay, just east of Alexandria. The French admiral, François-Paul Bruys, believed his anchored line of warships was protected by shallow sandbanks on one side and heavy naval cannons on the other. But Nelson possessed daring tactical genius. Dividing his fleet, Nelson ordered half of his warships to squeeze dangerously between the front French ships and the treacherous shore, while the other half attacked from the open sea. Squeezed in a deadly crossfire, the French ships were attacked one by one on their unprepared landward sides. The Battle of the Nile raged throughout the hot summer night. The climax arrived at 10 o'clock when the colossal flagship of the French fleet, the 120-gun Lorient, caught fire and exploded with a shockwave so massive it shook the ships for miles around and silenced the guns of both fleets for several minutes. By morning, the French fleet was almost completely destroyed or captured. With a single tactical stroke, Admiral Nelson had destroyed Napoleon's naval bridge back to Europe. The victory gave Great Britain absolute command of the Mediterranean Sea. Napoleon and his 35,000 veteran soldiers were completely trapped in Egypt. Far from panicking, Napoleon accepted the news with incredible composure. Turning to his officers, he remarked with an ironic smile, "Well, boys, here we are stuck in this land, and we must emerge from it great, like the ancients." Knowing that the Ottoman Empire had declared war on France in response to the invasion of Egypt, Napoleon launched a preemptive campaign into Syria, modern-day Israel and Palestine, in early 1799 to crush an advancing Ottoman army. The Syrian campaign was a brutal, grueling affair. The French captured El Arish, Gaza, and Jaffa, but their momentum ground to a halt at the ancient coastal fortress of Acre. Defended by a fierce Ottoman commander and assisted by a British naval squadron under Sir Sidney Smith, Acre held out against 7 desperate French assaults. Starved of heavy siege guns and suffering from a terrible outbreak of the bubonic plague among his troops, Napoleon was forced to order a painful retreat back to Egypt in May 1799. It was his first major strategic setback. Returning to Cairo, Napoleon inflicted one last crushing defeat on an Ottoman army that had landed by sea at the Battle of Abuka in July 1799, driving thousands of enemy troops into the sea. Yet, despite this tactical triumph, Napoleon knew the strategic reality was grim. He was isolated from France, his army was slowly shrinking through combat and disease, and no reinforcements were coming. Then, through a bundle of recent European newspapers handed to him by a British naval officer during a brief truce, Napoleon learned of catastrophic news from home. While he had been fighting in the desert, a new coalition, the Second Coalition, comprising Britain, Russia, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, had declared war on France. In Italy, the legendary Russian Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov had swept away all of Napoleon's victories, destroying the sister republics and driving French forces back to the borders of the Alps. Corruption in Paris was worse than ever, the French economy had collapsed, and political chaos threatened to plunge the nation back into civil war. The Directory was on the verge of total collapse, and the people of France were crying out for a strong, decisive leader to save the Republic. Napoleon realized that his moment had finally arrived. Keeping his plan secret from all but a few trusted officers, Napoleon handed command of the Egyptian army to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber. On the dark night of August 23, 1799, Napoleon boarded a small French frigate, the Muiron, and slipped out of Alexandria harbor under the noses of patrolling British warships. Sailing across the Mediterranean against prevailing winds and dodging enemy patrols for 6 dangerous weeks, Napoleon landed on the southern coast of France at Fréjus on October 9, 1799. The news of his return spread like wildfire across the country. Towns illuminated their windows, bands played, and cheering crowds lined the roads as his carriage journeyed toward Paris. The people did not see a general who had abandoned his army in the sands of Egypt. They saw the invincible hero of Lodi and Rivoli, the conqueror of Italy, returning to save France from ruin. When Napoleon arrived in Paris on October 16, he found a city waiting for a master. The time for battlefield glory had passed. The grandest battle of his life was about to be fought in the political chambers of power. 5. The coup and the first consul. When Napoleon arrived in Paris in October 1799, the city was vibrating with anxiety. The Directory had lost all remaining moral authority. Public treasury reserves were empty, paper currency was worthless, banditry plagued the rural highways, and political factionalism threatened to throw the nation back into the bloody days of 1793. Though military victories by General André Massena in Switzerland had temporarily halted the immediate danger of foreign invasion, the political system in Paris was utterly paralyzed. Prominent politicians inside the government realized that the current constitution was unworkable. Chief among them was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, commonly known as the Abbé Sieyès, a brilliant political theorist who had played a key role in the opening days of the revolution in 1789. Sieyès was serving as one of the 5 directors, but he secretly wanted to overthrow his own government. He envisioned drafting a new, stable constitution with a powerful executive. To execute a successful political coup, however, Sieyès needed what he called a sword, a popular, decisive military general who could command the respect of the army and intimidate political opponents without seizing power for himself. Initially, Sieyès considered other military figures, but Napoleon's unexpected return from Egypt changed everything. Napoleon was by far the most famous, charismatic, and politically ambitious general in France. When the two men met in Paris, a quiet bargain was struck. Sieyès believed he was using the young general as a simple tool to achieve his constitutional vision. Napoleon, equally calculating, allowed Sieyès to think he was in control while quietly ensuring that he himself would emerge at the absolute center of power. Joining the conspiracy were key figures from across the French political landscape: Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother, who had recently been elected president of the Council of 500, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a master of political survival and diplomatic intrigue, and Joseph Fouché, the ruthless minister of police who controlled a vast network of spies and informants. The conspiracy was scheduled for 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, according to the revolutionary calendar. The plot was designed to look entirely legal on the surface. The conspirators fabricated a fake threat, spreading rumors through Paris that a radical Jacobin plot was on the verge of launching a bloody uprising. Under the pretext of protecting the legislature from this imminent danger, the Council of Ancients, persuaded by allies of the conspiracy, voted to transfer both parliamentary houses out of central Paris to the royal estate of St. Cloud, 5 miles west of the city. To ensure order during the transition, the legislature appointed General Napoleon Bonaparte commander of all military forces in the Paris region. At the same time, the executive directory was systematically dismantled. Sieyès and another allied director resigned voluntarily. Talleyrand was dispatched with a heavy purse of money to bribe director Paul Barras into signing his resignation, while the remaining 2 conservative directors were placed under house arrest by army troops commanded by General Jean-Victor Moreau. By the night of 18 Brumaire, the Directory had effectively ceased to exist. Step 1 of the coup was a total success. However, Step 2, securing the voluntary approval of the 2 parliamentary houses at St. Cloud the following morning, proved to be an absolute disaster. On 19 Brumaire, November 10, 1799, the deputies of the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients gathered in the grand halls of the Palace of St. Cloud. As the hours dragged on, the deputies began to realize that there was no Jacobin plot. They realized they had been removed from the city to facilitate a military coup. Anger swept through the chambers. The deputies refused to vote for a new government, instead taking turns renewing their solemn oaths to defend the existing constitution. Pacing impatiently in the courtyard outside surrounded by his soldiers, Napoleon realized the plot was unraveling. Losing his patience, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Napoleon strode into the chamber of the Council of Ancients, accompanied by a small escort of officers. He intended to deliver a forceful, persuasive speech, but Napoleon was a master of battlefield command, not parliamentary debate. Facing hundreds of hostile politicians shouting interruptions, Napoleon became visibly flustered. His speech was rambling and disconnected. He spoke of military victories, warned of vague dangers, and declared, "Remember that I walk accompanied by the god of war and the god of fortune." The deputies mocked him, demanding specifics and shouting down his arguments. Deeply shaken and pale, Napoleon was pulled out of the hall by his loyal officers. Realizing the situation was far more dangerous in the lower house, Napoleon then marched into the Orangery, where the Council of 500 was meeting. The reaction was immediate and furious. The sight of an armed general entering a legislative chamber with soldiers violated every revolutionary principle. Outraged Jacobin deputies leaped from their seats, surrounding Napoleon. They shouted, "Down with the tyrant! Outlaw him! Outlaw him!" The exact phrase that had sent Robespierre to the guillotine 5 years earlier. In the chaotic crush that followed, deputies shoved Napoleon, grabbed him by the collar, and cursed him. Overwhelmed by claustrophobia and physical shock, the conqueror of Italy almost fainted and had to be dragged out of the building by his grenadiers, his face scratched and bleeding. It was the closest Napoleon ever came to political ruin. Had the assembly voted to declare him an outlaw at that moment, the army might have hesitated, and the coup would have collapsed. The situation was saved by the quick thinking and iron nerve of his brother, Lucien Bonaparte. As president of the Council of 500, Lucien tried desperately to restore order, but the chamber was in complete chaos. Refusing to put the vote for his brother's outlawry to the floor, Lucien slipped out of the hall into the courtyard, where the line infantry and Imperial Guard troops were standing in formation, nervous and uncertain about what was happening inside. Mounting a horse beside his brother, Lucien addressed the waiting troops. He claimed that a group of armed, fanatical deputies paid by English gold had seized control of the assembly and were attempting to assassinate their general. To prove his loyalty to the Republic, Lucien drew a sword, pointed it directly at Napoleon's chest, and declared to the crowd of soldiers, "I swear that I would stab my own brother to the heart if I thought he was an enemy to the liberty of France." The theatrical gesture broke the troops' hesitation. Napoleon gave the command to act. General Joachim Murat, his saber drawn, stepped forward and ordered the drum roll. A column of heavy grenadiers with fixed bayonets marched directly into the Orangery, their boots echoing ominously off the stone floor. As the bayonets cleared the doorway, Murat shouted his famous, unceremonious command, "Throw these people out of here!" Terrified by the advancing column of steel, the honorable representatives of the French people abandoned their seats. Deputies scrambled over desks, threw off their official robes, and jumped out of the ground floor windows into the foggy palace garden below, fleeing into the gathering dusk. Later that night, a handful of terrified, compliant deputies were rounded up from local taverns and brought back to the palace. Under the watchful eyes of Napoleon's troops, they voted to dissolve the Directory and replace it with a temporary executive commission, the Provisional Consulate. The coup of 19 Brumaire was over. Power had been seized, but it had been an extraordinarily messy, near-fatal affair. In the days that followed, the three provisional consuls, Napoleon, Sieyes, and Roger Ducos, set to work drafting a new constitution, known as the Constitution of Year 8. Sieyes had envisioned a complex system with a Grand Elector serving as a figurehead, while real power remained balanced among administrative councils. Napoleon quietly, systematically dismantled Sieyes' complex checks and balances. In every meeting, Napoleon outworked, out-argued, and outmaneuvered his fellow conspirators. When the final text was completed, absolute power was concentrated in the office of the first consul. The first consul possessed total executive authority. He alone appointed ministers, generals, civil servants, ambassadors, and judges. He possessed the sole authority to propose new laws. Two secondary consuls were created to advise him, but their votes were purely consultative. When Sieyes realized that Napoleon had taken complete control of the state, he retired quietly to his country estate, compensated with a large pension and land gifts. At just 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was named first consul of France. To legitimize his new regime, Napoleon submitted the constitution to a public vote, a plebiscite. Through heavily managed election results orchestrated by Joseph Fouché, the regime announced that over 3 million citizens had voted in favor of the new system, with only 1,500 voting against. While the numbers were manipulated, the sentiment was clear: the French people were exhausted by political chaos and willingly accepted a strong leader who promised order, stability, and national pride. Napoleon moved into the Tuileries Palace, taking up residence in the former quarters of the French kings. He set out to heal the deep wounds that had torn France apart for a decade. He issued a broad amnesty for political émigrés, allowing nobles and moderate politicians who had fled during the Terror to return home. He ended the persecution of the Catholic Church, reopening churches and allowing non-Iranian priests to return to their parishes. He established financial order by creating the Bank of France, stabilizing the currency, and ensuring that taxes were collected efficiently and fairly. However, Napoleon knew that all his domestic political gains would vanish if he could not defeat the foreign armies of the Second Coalition. While France was organizing its new government, Austria and Great Britain remained actively at war with the Republic. In Italy, Austrian forces commanded by General Michael von Mellers had pushed the French back, trapping General Massena and thousands of French troops inside the port city of Genoa, where they were reduced to eating horses and dogs under a terrible siege. To win the war, Napoleon crafted a daring strategic plan that mirrored the boldness of his famous 1796 campaign. Instead of launching a direct, predictable attack against the main Austrian forces in Germany, Napoleon decided to attack the Austrians in Italy from an unexpected direction, from behind. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon quietly assembled a secret force near Dijon, known as the Army of the Reserve. In May 1800, Napoleon led 40,000 men directly across the snowbound, jagged peaks of the Swiss Alps through the formidable Great St. Bernard Pass, a treacherous mountain trail over 8,000 feet above sea level. The march was an epic feat of human endurance and military engineering. The mountain paths were covered in deep ice and snow, with narrow ledges dropping off into abyss. Heavy siege cannons were removed from their wheeled carriages, placed inside hollowed-out pine trunks, and dragged up the steep mountain slopes by teams of 100 soldiers at a time, pulling to the cadence of beating drums. In a famous, iconic painting commissioned later by the King of Spain, the artist Jacques-Louis David depicted Napoleon riding a rearing, magnificent white horse over the stormy peaks. In reality, Napoleon crossed the dangerous pass sitting comfortably on the back of a sturdy, sure-footed local mule, guided by a young mountain guide. Descending from the clouds into the sunny plains of northern Italy, Napoleon caught the Austrian high command in complete surprise. He bypassed heavy mountain forts and marched straight into Milan on June 2, capturing vast enemy supply depots and severing General Mellers' main line of communication and retreat back to Austria. However, Napoleon's rapid advance created a dangerous tactical vulnerability. Unsure of the exact location of the main Austrian army and believing Mellers was attempting to retreat toward the coast, Napoleon scattered his forces, sending major divisions under General Louis Desaix and General Jean Lannes in different directions to search for the enemy. It was a classic strategic mistake. General Mellers was not retreating, he was assembling his entire army of 31,000 well-equipped troops and 100 heavy cannons inside the fortress city of Alessandria, preparing to strike. On the morning of June 14, 1800, the Austrians launched a massive, sudden counter-offensive across the Bormida River, catching Napoleon completely off guard near the small village of Marengo. The Battle of Marengo began disastrously for the French. Outnumbered 2-1 in men and severely outgunned in artillery, the 23,000 French troops were forced onto the defensive. For hours under a scorching summer sun, French soldiers fought a desperate delaying action among the vineyards, farmhouses, and muddy ditches of the Marengo plain. Napoleon personally managed the defense, using his Imperial Guard units to hold the center, but the sheer weight of Austrian artillery and cavalry pushed the French line back mile after mile. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the French retreat was turning into a chaotic rout. Convinced he had won a decisive, glorious victory, the 71-year-old Austrian commander, General Mellers, who had been slightly wounded during the battle, left the field and returned to his headquarters in Alessandria to write a triumphant letter to the Emperor in Vienna. He handed command of the pursuit to his chief of staff, General Anton von Zach, who arranged his army into a long, confident marching column to drive the fleeing French from the field. Napoleon refused to give up. He had dispatched urgent couriers early that morning to find General Louis Desaix, who was several miles away with his 6,000-man division. At roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as Napoleon watched his retreat with desperate anxiety, General Desaix arrived on the field at the head of his fresh troops. Riding up to Napoleon, Desaix pulled out his watch, looked at the declining sun, and made a famous, legendary statement: "This battle is completely lost. However, there is still time to win another one." Napoleon immediately organized a sudden, ferocious counterstroke. General Desaix led his fresh infantry division straight down the road into the head of the marching Austrian column, surprising the confident enemy. As Desaix's troops opened fire, French artillery unlimbered and poured grapeshot into the compact ranks. At that exact moment, heavy cavalry led by General François-Étienne Kellermann executed one of the most brilliant, perfectly timed cavalry charges in history. Squeezing his heavy dragoons through a gap in the trees, Kellermann slammed directly into the exposed flank of the Austrian infantry column. The impact was devastating. The Austrian marching column was sliced in two. General von Zach was captured on the spot, and panic spread through the Austrian ranks like wildfire. Within an hour, the victory that the Austrians had celebrated at 2 o'clock was transformed into an absolute, disastrous defeat. The entire Austrian army broke into a panicked rout, fleeing back across the Bormida River. The French had won the Battle of Marengo, but the triumph came at a heavy personal price. In the very first minutes of the counterattack, the 32-year-old General Louis Desaix was shot through the heart and killed instantly. Napoleon wept bitterly over the body of his brave friend, who had arrived just in time to save his career and his life. The stunning victory at Marengo, combined with another brilliant French triumph led by General Moreau at the Battle of Hohenlinden in Germany 6 months later, broke the will of the Second Coalition. In February 1801, Austria signed the Treaty of Luneville, reaffirming France's control over Italy and the Rhineland. 17 months later, in March 1802, a weary Great Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens. For the first time in 10 long, bloody years, the entire continent of Europe was at peace. Napoleon returned to Paris in absolute triumph. He had restored order at home, crushed the foreign armies abroad, and secured a general peace that the French people had craved for a decade. His position as first consul was completely unassailable. In 1802, Napoleon submitted another plebiscite to the public. By an overwhelming majority, the French people voted to appoint Napoleon first consul for life, granting him the right to nominate his own successor. With absolute power secured, Napoleon turned his restless, extraordinary energy toward his greatest domestic achievement, rebuilding the civil infrastructure of France. He reorganized the nation's educational system, creating elite secondary schools called lycées to train the future administrative and military leaders of the nation. He established a unified, efficient national bureaucracy, paved thousands of miles of stone roads, built bridges, improved harbors, and cleared canals. In July 1801, Napoleon signed the historic Concordat with Pope Pius VII. This agreement healed the deep, painful wound created during the Revolution by officially restoring the Catholic Church in France while ensuring that land seized during the Revolution remained with its new owners. Religion was recognized as the religion of the majority of French citizens, but religious freedom was preserved for Protestants and Jews. However, Napoleon's most enduring monument was his massive reform of the legal system, the Civil Code, universally known as the Code Napoleon. Before the Revolution, France was a patchwork nightmare of competing, contradictory legal systems. Northern France operated under ancient Frankish custom laws, while southern France used Roman law. Local lords, bishops, and royal courts issued conflicting decrees, leaving ordinary citizens with no clear legal protections. Napoleon personally chaired over half of the 84 debate sessions dedicated to drafting the code, arguing fine legal points alongside the nation's finest legal scholars late into the night. Promulgated in March 1804, the Napoleonic Code established a single, clear, unified legal system for the entire nation. It enshrined the core structural victories of the French Revolution: equality of all citizens before the law, abolition of feudal privileges, hereditary nobility, and birthrights, freedom of religion and conscience, the right to choose one's own profession, absolute legal protection for private property. Though the code contained conservative social elements, particularly regarding family structures, where wives were placed under the legal authority of their husbands, it was an extraordinary masterpiece of modern legal thought. As Napoleon's armies marched across Europe in the years that followed, they brought the Napoleonic Code with them, shattering feudalism and laying the legal foundations for modern European society. Napoleon himself recognized that his legal legacy would outshine his military glory. Years later, exiled on the lonely rock of St. Helena, he reflected, "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories. But what nothing will erase, what will live forever, is my civil code." Yet, despite this period of peace and progress, dark shadows swirled beneath the surface. Royalist plotters funded by British gold made repeated attempts to assassinate the first consul. The most terrifying occurred on Christmas Eve in 1800, when a massive bomb hidden inside a horse-drawn barrel, known as the Machine Infernale, exploded in a narrow Paris street moments after Napoleon's carriage passed by, killing dozens of innocent bystanders. In early 1804, French police uncovered a grand royalist conspiracy involving General Charles Pichegru and the famous Chouan rebel leader Georges Cadoudal. They intended to kidnap or murder Napoleon and restore the Bourbon monarchy. Furious and convinced that the royal family in exile was actively funding these assassination attempts, Napoleon decided to send a terrifying, definitive message to his enemies. In March 1804, Napoleon dispatched a team of French cavalry officers across the border into the neutral German state of Baden. They seized a young Bourbon prince, the Duke of Enghien, who was residing near the border. Though there was virtually no evidence linking the young duke directly to the active assassination plot in Paris, he was rushed to the fortress of Vincennes outside Paris, subjected to a brief, midnight court-martial, found guilty of bearing arms against France, and executed by a firing squad in the fortress moat. The execution of the Duke of Enghien sent a shockwave of horror through the royal courts of Europe. Talleyrand famously summarized the incident with cynical accuracy: "It was worse than a crime, it was a blunder." For Napoleon, however, the constant assassination attempts highlighted a fundamental political weakness. The stability of the entire French state depended entirely on the life of one man. If Napoleon were killed tomorrow, the First Consulate would collapse, and civil war would erupt once again. To ensure the permanent continuity of his regime and place France on an equal legal footing with the ancient monarchies of Europe, Napoleon made a breathtaking political decision. He determined that the French Republic required a hereditary monarchy, not under the hated Bourbons, but under a new dynasty born of the Revolution itself. In May 1804, the French Senate passed a decree declaring that the government of the Republic was entrusted to a hereditary emperor of the French. A national plebiscite confirmed the decision by an overwhelming majority. The 35-year-old artillery officer from Corsica had reached the absolute summit of political power. On the cold, brilliant morning of December 2, 1804, the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of velvet, gold, and silk. Thousands of dignitaries, generals, foreign ambassadors, and scholars filled the stone nave. Pope Pius VII had traveled all the way from Rome to bless the sacred ceremony. As the grand procession entered the cathedral, Napoleon walked beside Empress Josephine, wearing a crimson velvet coronation robe embroidered with golden bees, the ancient symbol of France's early Merovingian kings. When the moment arrived for the crown to be placed upon his head, Napoleon executed a profound, carefully rehearsed political statement. Instead of allowing the Pope to crown him, which would imply that his authority was subject to the Church, Napoleon turned, reached out, took the golden laurel wreath crown from the altar with his own hands, and placed it firmly upon his own head. He then took the smaller crown and placed it gently upon the head of the kneeling Empress Josephine. By crowning himself, Napoleon I signaled to the world that his authority came not from divine right or religious decree, but from his own military genius, his administrative achievement, and the sovereign will of the French people. The French Republic was dead. The First French Empire was born. Sitting upon his grand golden throne in Notre Dame, looking out over the crowded cathedral, the newly crowned emperor turned to his older brother Joseph and whispered in their native Corsican tongue, "Joseph, if our father could see us now." The young eagle had achieved his ultimate height, but the crowned heads of Europe looked on with bitter, renewed fury. To the ancient monarchies of London, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Berlin, this crowned Jacobin was an illegitimate usurper who had placed a revolutionary crown upon his head. The brief window of peace was closing fast. The greatest, most destructive military struggles in European history were about to begin, and Napoleon was waiting for them. 6. The Master of Europe. The grand coronation at Notre Dame had barely concluded before the clouds of war gathered once again over the European continent. Great Britain, watching Napoleon's growing influence in Italy and the Low Countries with intense alarm, had already broken the fragile Peace of Amiens in 1803. British gold flowed into the treasuries of Europe, forging a massive new alliance, the Third Coalition, comprising Great Britain, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of Naples. To the monarchs of Europe, Napoleon was an unstoppable usurper whose revolutionary empire threatened the very foundation of royal bloodlines. They assembled over 300,000 men to strike France simultaneously from Germany, Italy, and the Mediterranean. Napoleon, however, was already 2 steps ahead. For 2 years, along the windswept cliffs of Boulogne on the English Channel, Napoleon had been assembling, training, and perfecting a magnificent military force, the Grande Army. This was not merely a collection of soldiers, it was arguably the most formidable war machine the world had ever seen. Numbering nearly 200,000 men, the Grande Army was made up of hardened veterans of the Revolutionary Wars fused with enthusiastic young conscripts. They were organized into Napoleon's perfected corps system, 7 independent army corps, each commanded by a trusted marshal of France, including military giants like Louis-Nicolas Davout, Jean Lannes, Michel Ney, and Nicolas Soult. When news reached Paris in late August 1805 that a vast Austrian army under General Karl Mack was advancing into Bavaria, while a massive Russian army under Prince Mikhail Kutuzov was marching west to join them, Napoleon acted with terrifying speed. Abandoning his plans to cross the English Channel, Napoleon turned the Grande Army around. In an incredible feat of logistics, 200,000 French troops marched hundreds of miles across Europe in total secrecy, covered by a dense screen of cavalry commanded by the dashing Marshal Joachim Murat. The Austrian commander, General Mack, sat comfortably in the fortress city of Ulm, expecting the French to advance through the narrow passes of the Black Forest. Instead, Napoleon executed a giant wheeling maneuver, the Grand Maneuver d'Ulm. Sweeping far to the north, the French corps crossed the Danube River, completely surrounding Mack's army from behind before the Austrian commander even realized the main French force was in Bavaria. Cut off from the approaching Russian army and completely encircled, General Mack realized his position was hopeless. On October 20, 1805, without firing a single major shot, Mack surrendered his entire army of 60,000 men at Ulm. In a single, bloodless strategic campaign, Napoleon had wiped out the principal Austrian army in Germany. Yet, even as Napoleon celebrated this operational masterpiece, a crushing blow struck from the sea. Just one day after Mack surrendered at Ulm, on October 21, 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleets under Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve engaged the British Royal Navy off the coast of Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar. The British commander, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, executed a daring tactical plan, driving his ships in two perpendicular columns straight through the Franco-Spanish line. In a ferocious, chaotic battle of point-blank broadsides, Nelson smashed the combined fleet, capturing or destroying 19 French and Spanish ships without losing a single British vessel. Though Nelson was killed in the final hours of the battle by a French musketeer, his victory at Trafalgar was absolute. It guaranteed Great Britain total, undisputed command of the oceans for the next century, completely ending any lingering French dream of invading the British Isles. Napoleon was now trapped on the land, but on land, he remained invincible. Driving his victorious corps eastward along the Danube Valley, Napoleon captured the Austrian capital of Vienna in mid-November without a fight. But the campaign was entering a dangerous phase. The surviving Austrian forces had united with the vast Russian army under Tsar Alexander I and Field Marshal Kutuzov in Moravia, modern-day Czech Republic. Deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from his supply bases, with winter setting in and his troops exhausted, Napoleon knew he could not afford a long, drawn-out war of attrition. He needed a single, decisive battle to shatter the Third Coalition. To force the Allies into attacking him, Napoleon set a brilliant psychological trap. Advancing past the town of Brunn, Napoleon carefully surveyed a stretch of rolling country anchored by a high landform known as the Pratzen Heights, near the small village of Austerlitz. Recognizing that the Pratzen Heights was the natural key to the entire battlefield, Napoleon did something extraordinary. He deliberately left the high ground unoccupied, and intentionally weakened his own right flank along the Goldbach stream. He then sent diplomatic envoys to the Allied headquarters, feigning fear, hesitation, and a desperate desire for peace. The young, ambitious Tsar Alexander I fell into the trap completely. Overriding the cautious advice of his veteran general, Kutuzov, the Tsar believed Napoleon was on the verge of retreat. Seeing the weak French right flank, the Allied commanders decided to hurl the mass of their 90,000-man army down off the Pratzen Heights to crush Napoleon's right, cut off his line of retreat to Vienna, and destroy him. This was exactly what Napoleon wanted them to do. On the eve of the battle, December 1, 1805, which marked the eve of the first anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon walked through the freezing encampments of his army. When the soldiers recognized their emperor in his famous grey overcoat, thousands of men raised torches made of straw, illuminating the dark hills with a fiery sea of light, cheering "Vive l'Empereur." Napoleon smiled at his officers and murmured, "This is the finest evening of my life." Dawn broke on December 2, 1805, bringing a thick, icy fog that blanketed the valleys around Austerlitz. As the sun began to rise, a brilliant, golden orb that history would remember as the Sun of Austerlitz, the massive Allied columns began their heavy descent off the Pratzen Heights, driving hard against the weakened French right flank along the Goldbach stream. There, holding the line against overwhelming odds, was the elite 4th Corps under the iron command of Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout. Davout's men had marched an incredible 70 miles in 48 hours from Vienna to reach the field, and they held their ground with unbelievable tenacity against wave after wave of Russian charges. Napoleon waited patiently in the center, watching through his spyglass as the Pratzen Heights gradually emptied of Allied troops. At 9 o'clock in the morning, seeing that the center of the Allied line was stripped of reserves, Napoleon turned to Marshal Soult and asked a simple question: "How long will it take your corps to reach the top of the heights?" "Less than 20 minutes, sire," Soult replied. "Then go," Napoleon commanded. "In 20 minutes, the heights will be ours." Out of the dense fog of the valley, 40,000 French infantry under Marshal Soult and Bernadotte surged up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights in a surprise, thunderous attack. The Allied commanders watched in absolute horror as the French army suddenly materialized in the very center of their positions. The Tsar tried frantically to hurry troops back up the hill, but it was too late. In a fierce, hand-to-hand struggle, the French captured the heights, slicing the Allied army completely in two. With the high ground secured, Napoleon brought up his heavy artillery and unleashed a devastating flank attack down onto the trapped Russian and Austrian columns below. The Allied left flank collapsed into total chaos. Thousands of fleeing Russian soldiers attempted to escape across the frozen surface of the Sachin ponds. Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire high-explosive shells directly onto the ice. The heavy cannonballs shattered the frozen surface, plunging men, horses, and cannons into the freezing water. The Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, was Napoleon's ultimate tactical masterpiece. The Allied army was annihilated, losing over 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with all their artillery, while the French suffered fewer than 9,000 casualties. 2 days after the battle, the Emperor of Austria, Francis I, arrived at Napoleon's field tent to personally beg for an armistice. Under the Treaty of Pressburg, Austria was forced to cede vast territories in Italy and Germany, paying a massive war indemnity. The 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire was officially dissolved, replaced by Napoleon with a union of German states under French protection known as the Confederation of the Rhine. When news of the disaster at Austerlitz reached the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, he stared at a map of Europe hanging on his wall and famously remarked, "Roll up that map, it will not be wanted these 10 years." Pitt died a few weeks later. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of Western and Central Europe. But new challenges quickly emerged from the north. The Kingdom of Prussia, proud of its legendary military heritage forged by Frederick the Great, had remained neutral during the War of the Third Coalition. But watching Napoleon redraw the map of Germany on Prussia's very doorstep sparked intense anti-French fury in Berlin, heavily encouraged by the fiery, beautiful Queen Louise of Prussia. Convinced that the army of Frederick the Great could easily defeat the French, King Frederick William III issued an ultimatum to Napoleon in September 1806, demanding that all French troops withdraw west of the Rhine. Napoleon received the ultimatum with cold amusement, remarking, "I pity Prussia, she will be destroyed." In October 1806, Napoleon launched a lightning invasion of Saxony and Thuringia, marching 180,000 men through the dense Thuringian forest in his famous battalion car, a square formation, ready to strike in any direction. On October 14, 1806, the fate of Prussia was sealed in a single afternoon in two simultaneous battles fought 12 miles apart. At the Battle of Jena, Napoleon, believing he was facing the main Prussian army, launched a massive attack that shattered 50,000 Prussian and Saxon troops under the Prince of Hohenlohe. Meanwhile, 12 miles to the north at the Battle of Austerlitz, Marshal Davout's single corps of 26,000 men encountered the actual main Prussian army of 63,000 men led by the Duke of Brunswick and King Frederick William III himself. Facing 2-to-1 odds, Davout demonstrated why he was known as the Iron Marshal. Forming his infantry into solid tactical squares, he repulsed every massive Prussian cavalry charge. When the Duke of Brunswick was mortally wounded, Davout launched a relentless counterattack that completely routed the Prussian main force. The twin disasters of Jena and Austerlitz broke the spine of the Prussian military state. In less than 3 weeks, the Grande Army captured every major Prussian fortress, and on October 27, 1806, Napoleon rode victorious through the Grand Brandenburg Gate into Berlin. While in Berlin, Napoleon launched a sweeping economic weapon against Great Britain, the Continental System. Through the Berlin Decree, Napoleon banned all trade, communication, and commercial shipping with the British Isles across every territory controlled by France or its allies. By closing the ports of Europe to British goods, Napoleon hoped to ruin Britain's economy and force the nation of shopkeepers to surrender. However, the Continental System would prove to be a double-edged sword, creating massive smuggling networks and forcing Napoleon into increasingly desperate military conflicts to enforce his blockade across the continent. To complete the destruction of the Fourth Coalition, Napoleon had to face one remaining enemy, the Russian Empire, whose armies were assembling in the freezing, snowbound plains of East Prussia and Poland. What followed was one of the most miserable, brutal winter campaigns in modern history. The French soldiers, far from home, struggled through waist-deep mud, freezing temperatures, and barren landscapes where food was virtually non-existent. On February 8, 1807, in a blinding blizzard, Napoleon met the Russian army commanded by General Levin August von Bennigsen at the Battle of Eylau. It was a terrifying, bloody nightmare fought in a snowstorm so thick that officers could not see their own soldiers 10 paces away. At a critical moment in the battle, a Russian counterattack nearly captured Napoleon himself at the town cemetery. To save his center, Napoleon turned to his cavalry commander, Marshal Joachim Murat, and ordered one of the greatest cavalry charges in recorded history. Murat led 11,000 French heavy cavalry, dragoons and cuirassiers, straight through the blinding snow into the Russian lines. The ground shook as thousands of armored horses smashed into the Russian infantry, riding through 2 complete defensive lines before wheeling around to cut their way back. The Battle of Eylau ended in a horrific stalemate, with over 40,000 men killed or wounded on the snow-covered field. It was the first time Napoleon had failed to achieve an absolute victory on the battlefield. For months later, however, when the spring sun dried the roads, Napoleon achieved his definitive triumph. On June 14, 1807, the anniversary of Marengo, Napoleon caught Bennigsen's Russian army pinned against a bend in the Al River at the Battle of Friedland. Recognizing that the Russian army had its back to a deep river with only a few narrow bridges behind it, Napoleon unleashed his artillery and launched a relentless assault on the Russian left flank led by Marshal Ney. The French attack drove the Russian army back into the river. Thousands of Russian soldiers drowned attempting to swim across the cold water under heavy artillery fire. Friedland was a decisive, crushing triumph. Tsar Alexander I realized that further resistance was impossible. He requested an armistice. In July 1807, the 2 most powerful monarchs in the world met for a historic summit in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit, on the border of Prussia and Russia. To ensure absolute equality, a magnificent pavilion decorated with silken laurels was built on a wooden raft floating in the center of the river. Stepping onto the raft, the young Tsar Alexander I greeted Napoleon with famous words, "I hate the English as much as you do, and I will be your second in all that you undertake against them." In that case, Napoleon replied with a warm smile, "Peace is made." Over the next 2 weeks, the 2 leaders held long, intimate conversations, walking together, dining, and discussing the division of the world. Alexander was completely captivated by Napoleon's extraordinary charm and intellect. Under the treaties of Tilsit, Prussia was stripped of half its territory, which was transformed into the Duchy of Warsaw, a revived Polish state under French protection, and the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's younger brother, Jerome. Russia agreed to join the Continental System against Britain, and in exchange, Napoleon gave Alexander a free hand to expand into Finland and the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon had reached the absolute zenith of his power. From the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of Russia, Europe was transformed into a vast Napoleonic network. Family members sat on foreign thrones, sister republics were integrated into the empire, and old enemies were forced into alliance. Yet, sitting upon his golden throne in Paris in the summer of 1807, surrounded by glory, Napoleon made a fateful decision that would ignite a slow, bleeding wound, a wound that would slowly consume his empire from within. Looking at the map of Europe, Napoleon noticed a small nation along the Atlantic coast that continued to fly the British flag and open its ports to British trade in direct defiance of his continental system. That nation was Portugal. And to reach Portugal, Napoleon's armies would first have to cross through Spain. The seeds of his destruction were planted, and the grandest, darkest chapters of the Napoleonic storm were about to unfold. 7. The Spanish Ulcer and the Austrian Revenge. By 1807, Napoleon's control over continental Europe seemed complete. Yet, the continental system, his economic blockade intended to starve Great Britain into submission, had a glaring loophole along the Atlantic coast. Portugal, a historic British ally, flatly refused to enforce the trade ban. Determined to plug the leak, Napoleon secured permission from the Spanish government to march French troops across Spain. In November 1807, French forces under General Jean-Andoche Junot entered Lisbon, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil aboard British warships. With Portugal occupied, Napoleon turned his gaze toward Spain itself. The Spanish Bourbon monarchy was in a state of pathetic decay, consumed by a bitter feud between the corrupt King Charles IV, his manipulative queen, and the rebellious Crown Prince Ferdinand. Seeing an opportunity to modernize Spain and secure his southern border, Napoleon made a catastrophic political miscalculation. He invited the Spanish royal family to a conference in the French border town of Bayonne, where he forced both the king and the prince to renounce their rights to the throne. Napoleon then handed the Spanish crown to his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, whom he transferred from the throne of Naples. Napoleon expected the Spanish people to welcome his brother as an enlightened reformer who would sweep away feudalism and the Inquisition. Instead, the Spanish populace saw the move as a humiliating national insult by an arrogant foreign invader. On May 2, 1808, a day immortalized as the Dos de Mayo, a bloody popular uprising exploded in the streets of Madrid. French troops under Marshal Joachim Murat crushed the revolt with ruthless firing squads, but the rebellion spread like wildfire across the country. Ordinary citizens, peasants, and local priests rose in a furious national war of defense. It was a new kind of conflict, a relentless, partisan struggle that the Spanish called the guerrilla, little war. Unlike formal European armies that met in open battle, Spanish guerrillas ambushed French supply columns, assassinated couriers, cut lines of communication, and vanished back into the rugged mountain terrain. Any French soldier who fell behind on the march faced a swift, brutal death. In July 1808, shockwaves rippled across Europe when an entire French army corps under General Pierre Dupont was surrounded and forced to surrender to Spanish forces at the Battle of Bailén. It was the first time a French army had been forced to lay down its arms in open field combat since the dawn of the Empire, completely shattering the myth of French invincibility. Shortly after, a British expeditionary force landed in Portugal under the command of a sharp, cautious young general named Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley defeated Junot at the Battle of Vimeo, driving the French out of Portugal entirely. King Joseph fled his new capital in Madrid, begging his brother for help. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Napoleon took personal command of the Grande Army. In November 1808, he swept into Spain with 300,000 veteran troops, smashing Spanish armies at Tudela and Gamonal, recapturing Madrid, and reinstating his brother on the throne. He then marched north through freezing winter blizzards to cut off a British army under Sir John Moore. Though Moore was killed at the Battle of Corunna while evacuating his troops aboard Royal Navy ships, Napoleon was forced to leave Spain before he could finish the campaign. Urgent dispatches from Paris warned him of a double crisis, a political plot involving his own ministers, Talleyrand and Fouché, and clear intelligence that Austria was mobilizing for a massive war of revenge. Napoleon returned to Paris, leaving the Spanish campaign to his marshals. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. For 6 agonizing years, over 300,000 French troops were trapped in a brutal, exhausting war of attrition that drained the empire's treasury and military reserves. Napoleon would later refer to this relentless bleeding as his Spanish ulcer. Taking advantage of French entanglements in Spain and funded by massive British subsidies, the Austrian Empire declared war in April 1809, launching the War of the Fifth Coalition. The Austrian military had undergone sweeping modern reforms under the brilliant leadership of the emperor's brother, Archduke Charles. Charles had adopted Napoleon's corps system, modernized his artillery, and inspired a wave of German national patriotism. When Archduke Charles launched a sudden invasion of Bavaria, Napoleon rushed to the front, organizing a brilliant 5-day maneuver around Ratisbon that forced the Austrians to retreat back along the northern bank of the Danube. By mid-May, Napoleon had occupied Vienna for the second time in 4 years. But Archduke Charles had destroyed all the bridges across the Danube, positioning his 90,000-man army on the northern bank, waiting for the French to attempt a crossing. Impatient to destroy the Austrian army before winter, Napoleon attempted a rushed, dangerous river crossing on the night of May 20, 1809. Using the small island of Libau as a staging ground, French troops threw fragile pontoon bridges across the roaring, swollen Danube, establishing a bridgehead near the twin villages of Aspern and Essling. Seeing the French crossing in force, Archduke Charles struck with overwhelming power. On May 21 to 22, 1809, the Battle of Aspern-Essling raged with unimaginable savagery. As 60,000 French troops desperately held the two stone villages against nearly 100,000 Austrians, heavy wooden barges and battering rams floated down the raging river by the Austrians shattered Napoleon's temporary bridges, severing his supply lines and cutting off reinforcements. For 2 days, French soldiers fought with their backs to the river, short on ammunition and surrounded by dead and dying comrades. During the desperate defense of Essling, one of Napoleon's closest friends and most brilliant commanders, Marshal Jean Lannes, was struck by a bouncing cannonball that shattered both his legs. Brought to the rear, Lannes died days later in Napoleon's arms, the first marshal of the empire to be killed in action. Realizing the position was untenable, Napoleon ordered a night retreat back to Libau Island. It was Napoleon's first direct personal defeat on the battlefield in over a decade. Europe held its breath. The Titan had bled. However, those who believed Napoleon was finished severely underestimated his resolve. Transforming Libau Island into a massive, fortified fortress complete with wooden bridges built on heavy pilings, star-rooms, and hospitals, Napoleon quietly built up a massive strike force over 6 weeks. On the dark, stormy night of July 4, 1809, amidst a blinding rainstorm, Napoleon launched a masterpiece of military engineering. Using prefabricated floating bridges, he transferred 160,000 troops and over 500 cannons across the Danube in a matter of hours, completely outflanking Archduke Charles' defensive lines. The two massive armies met on July 5 to 6, 1809 on the flat plains of Wagram. With over 300,000 men and 1,200 artillery pieces engaged, the Battle of Wagram was the largest, most destructive artillery duel the world had ever seen. The thunder of the cannons was so intense it was heard over 100 miles away. Archduke Charles launched a massive attempt to turn the French left flank and cut off Napoleon's retreat to the river. Napoleon responded with characteristic boldness. He created a colossal ground battery of 100 heavy cannons in the center, pounding the Austrian lines into dust. He then ordered General Jacques MacDonald to form a gigantic hollow square of 30,000 men, the famous MacDonald's Column, and drive it straight into the weakened Austrian center like a massive battering ram. After 2 days of relentless, apocalyptic slaughter that left over 70,000 casualties on the field, the Austrian center cracked. Archduke Charles ordered a controlled, orderly retreat. Though Wagram was a decisive strategic victory that forced Austria to sue for peace under the Treaty of Schönbrunn, it lacked the decisive, artful perfection of Austerlitz. The victories were becoming harder, bloodier, and far more costly. With Austria defeated for the fourth time, Napoleon stood at the absolute pinnacle of political power, yet he was deeply tormented by a personal crisis. At 40 years old, Napoleon had built a vast, magnificent empire, but he had no legitimate heir to secure his dynasty. His beloved wife, Empress Josephine, was 46 and could no longer bear children. Though he loved her deeply, Napoleon placed the political survival of his empire above his personal happiness. In a heartbreaking official ceremony in December 1809, Napoleon and Josephine dissolved their marriage, weeping as they signed the legal papers. Seeking to legitimize his new dynasty among the ancient royal bloodlines of Europe, Napoleon sought a royal bride. In April 1810, he married the 18-year-old Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I and the grandniece of the executed Queen Marie Antoinette. 1 year later, on March 20, 1801, the bells of Paris rang out as Marie-Louise gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Napoleon Francois-Joseph Charles. The proud emperor immediately proclaimed the infant child the King of Rome and heir to the French Empire. Napoleon seemed to have secured everything: an empire that spanned from Spain to Poland, a royal bride, an heir, and a continent at peace. Yet, behind the grand tapestries of the Tuileries Palace, the foundations of the Napoleonic world were beginning to crack. The economic misery caused by the continental system was pushing European merchants to the brink of ruin. In Spain, the guerrilla war continued to devour French armies month after month. And in St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander I was growing increasingly resentful of French influence in Poland, Russian economic damage from the British blockade, and Napoleon's marriage to an Austrian princess. In December 1810, Tsar Alexander officially withdrew Russia from the continental system, reopening Russian ports to neutral and British trade. The alliance forged on the raft at Tilsit was dead. The two titans of Europe were on an inevitable collision course, one that would lead Napoleon to march 600,000 men into the frozen vastness of the East. 8. The Frozen Abyss. By the spring of 1812, the fragile peace between the French Empire and the Russian Tsardom had completely disintegrated. Tsar Alexander I had openly abandoned the continental system, reopening Russian ports to British merchants and levying heavy tariffs on French goods. To Napoleon, this was not merely an economic dispute, it was a direct challenge to his authority that threatened to shatter his control over Europe. Determined to force Alexander back into submission, Napoleon assembled the largest multinational military force in recorded history, the Grande Army of 1812. Numbering over 600,000 men, this colossal army was a melting pot of nations. Less than half were French, the rest were troops levied from across the vast French sphere of influence: Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Austrians, and Prussians. They brought with them 200,000 horses and more than 1,200 heavy cannons. On June 24, 1812, without a formal declaration of war, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. He envisioned a swift, decisive campaign lasting no more than 20 days, a classic Napoleonic operation where he would catch the main Russian forces near the border, destroy them in a massive battle, and force the Tsar to negotiate. The Russians, however, had chosen a devastating strategy. Recognizing that they could not defeat Napoleon in open battlefield combat, the Russian commanders, principally Field Marshal Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, executed a deliberate, relentless retreat deep into the vast interior of their country. As they fell back, the Russians applied a brutal scorched earth policy. They burned crops, destroyed grain stores, poisoned wells, drove off livestock, and reduced every village and town in their path to smoldering ashes. As the summer sun beat down on the endless Polish and Russian plains, the Grand Army began to suffer without ever seeing a major enemy force. The heat was suffocating, roads turned into choking clouds of blinding dust, and clean water was impossible to find. Thousands of soldiers collapsed from heat stroke or succumbed to typhus and dysentery. Supply wagons lagged hundreds of miles behind the advancing columns. Tens of thousands of horses died from eating green, unripened rye, leaving heavy cavalry units dismounted and supply trains abandoned along the muddy tracks. By the time Napoleon reached the ancient city of Smolensk in mid-August, he had already lost nearly a third of his army to disease, exhaustion, and desertion, without a single major battle being fought. At Smolensk, the Russians made a brief, fierce stand to buy time before burning the historic city's wooden quarters and retreating once more toward Moscow. Napoleon's marshals, alarmed by the ballooning logistical nightmare, begged the emperor to halt the campaign, winter in Smolensk, and consolidate his positions until spring. Napoleon refused. Driven by the obsession to secure a single, glorious victory that would end the war, he pressed deeper into the Russian heartland. Pressure grew inside Russia against Barclay de Tolly's endless retreat. Tsar Alexander replaced him with the legendary, 67-year-old veteran Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov. Kutuzov understood that Moscow could not be abandoned without a fight. 70 miles west of the Holy City, near the small rural village of Borodino, Kutuzov halted his army of 120,000 men and built a formidable network of earthen fortifications, anchored by the massive Raevsky Redoubt in the center and the Bagration flèches on the left. On September 7, 1812, under a pale autumn sun, the two armies met in the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino. Unlike the brilliant tactical maneuvers of Austerlitz or Ulm, Borodino was a brutal, terrifying war of attrition, a head-on collision of heavy artillery and bayonets. From dawn until dusk, over 1,000 cannons poured an unrelenting storm of solid shot and grapeshot into dense infantry columns at point-blank range. Marshals Ney and Davout launched wave after wave of desperate assaults against the earthen redoubts, capturing and losing them repeatedly in hand-to-hand combat amidst piles of dismembered corpses. At a critical moment in the afternoon, with the Russian center severely fractured, Marshal Murat and Marshal Ney begged Napoleon to commit his ultimate reserve, the elite 20,000-man Imperial Guard, to deliver the final, crushing blow. Napoleon hesitated. Standing thousands of miles from France, deep in the heart of enemy territory, he looked at the shattered landscape and refused, stating, "I will not destroy my guard. At 3,000 leagues from Paris, I cannot risk my last reserve." The Imperial Guard remained idle, and Kutuzov was able to pull his battered forces back in good order under the cover of nightfall. The carnage at Borodino was appalling. Over 70,000 men fell in a single day, roughly 30,000 French and 45,000 Russians. The battlefield was described by survivors as a literal slaughterhouse, where the ground trembled from the thunder of cannons and the air was thick with the stench of copper and burning sulfur. 1 week later, on September 14, 1812, Napoleon rode into Moscow. He expected to be met by city officials bearing the keys to the Kremlin and a humble plea for peace from Tsar Alexander. Instead, he found a ghost city. Over 9/10 of Moscow's 250,000 residents had fled, taking their livestock and possessions with them, leaving behind deserted streets and empty houses. That very night, disaster struck. On the orders of the military governor of Moscow, Count Fyodor Rostopchin, hundreds of released prisoners and police agents set fire to the city's wooden buildings using hidden fuses and incendiary materials. A roaring autumn wind fanned the flames, transforming Moscow into an inferno. For 5 terrifying days, the Great Fire of Moscow raged out of control, consuming 3/4 of the city, destroying vital supply stores, and turning the ancient capital into a blackened shell of ash and stone. From his quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon watched the towering wall of fire with mounting dread, murmuring, "What a terrible spectacle! To do this themselves? What a people! They are Scythians!" For 5 agonizing weeks, Napoleon remained in the ruins of Moscow, waiting for a letter of surrender from Tsar Alexander that would never arrive. Every diplomatic overture Napoleon dispatched to St. Petersburg was met with absolute silence. Alexander declared that he would rather let his beard grow long and eat potatoes with his peasants in Siberia than sign a peace treaty while a single-armed French soldier remained on Russian soil. As October wore on, the first light dustings of autumn snow began to fall. Realizing that his army could not survive the winter in the ruined, barren city, Napoleon issued the inevitable command. On October 19, 1812, the Grande Army marched out of Moscow, beginning one of the most tragic and horrifying retreats in military history. Leaving the city, the retreat was slowed by thousands of wagons laden with war plunder, gold, silver, fine silk, and artwork, along with thousands of civilian camp followers, wounded soldiers, and French refugees. Napoleon attempted to march south through the fertile, unravaged region of Kaluga, but Kutuzov's Russian army blocked his path at the fierce Battle of Maloyaroslavets. Forced to give up his southern route, Napoleon was compelled to turn back onto the very same ruined road his army had destroyed during its advance, the desolate route through Smolensk. Then, winter arrived with sudden, catastrophic savagery. In early November, the Russian general winter struck with full force. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Blinding blizzards swept across the frozen plains, burying the road in deep drifts of ice and snow. The retreat turned into a nightmare of human suffering. Thousands of soldiers, wearing summer uniforms that were now rags, suffered severe frostbite. Noses, ears, and fingers turned black and rotted away. Men who sat down to rest by dying campfires simply froze to death where they sat. Horses, slipping on the icy tracks, died by the thousands. Starving soldiers cut meat from the dying animals while they were still standing, drinking their warm blood to stay alive. Weapons were tossed into snowbanks by frostbitten hands too numb to carry them. Harassing the retreating, freezing columns without rest were the Cossacks, wild, light cavalrymen mounted on swift steppe ponies. Emerging suddenly out of blinding snowstorms, Cossacks speared stragglers with long lances, cut down supply wagons, and vanished back into the white void before the French could organize a defense. Any soldier who fell behind the main column was stripped naked by local peasants and left to freeze in the snow. Through this apocalyptic hell, a hero emerged, Marshal Michel Ney, known as the bravest of the brave. Commanding the rear guard, Ney personally picked up a musket, stood in the freezing snow beside handfuls of exhausted soldiers, and fought off relentless Russian attacks day after day, ensuring that the remnants of the army could continue moving west. By late November, the shattered army reached the banks of the Berezina River. There, Napoleon discovered a fatal trap. The river, normally frozen solid in deep winter, had experienced a sudden thaw and was a raging torrent of ice-choked water. Russian armies commanded by General Chichagov and Field Marshal Kutuzov were rapidly closing in from three sides, threatening to completely surround and annihilate the remaining 40,000 combat-effective French troops. When all seemed lost, French military engineers executed a miraculous feat of sacrifice. Led by General Jean-Baptiste Ebel, 400 Dutch pontooniers waded waist-deep into the roaring, freezing waters of the Berezina. Working in sub-zero temperatures for hours at a time, surrounded by floating ice floes, they constructed 2 wooden pontoon bridges. Nearly every single engineer died of hypothermia or pneumonia in the days that followed, but their sacrifice opened an escape route. On November 26 to 29, 1812, during the dramatic Battle of Berezina, the remnants of the Grande Army, along with thousands of terrified civilian refugees, fought a desperate defensive battle while pouring across the fragile wooden bridges. When Russian artillery began shelling the crossing points, panic erupted. Thousands of civilians shoved, trampled, and crushed one another to reach the bridges. Hundreds fell into the icy river and drowned. When Ebel was forced to set fire to the bridges on the morning of November 29 to prevent the pursuing Russians from crossing, thousands of stranded camp followers were left behind to be slaughtered or captured by Cossacks. The crossing of the Berezina was a profound tragedy, but it was also a tactical triumph of iron will. Napoleon and the core of his army had escaped total destruction. On December 5, 1812, at the town of Smorgoni, Napoleon handed command of the army over to Marshal Murat and boarded a simple black carriage bound for Paris. He knew that as soon as news of the disaster reached Western Europe, political plots would erupt in Paris, and his subject nations would rise in revolt. He needed to reach his capital immediately to raise a new army. The invasion of Russia was over. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen River in the summer of 1812, fewer than 40,000 returned as an organized military force. Over 380,000 soldiers had died of cold, starvation, disease, or battle, while more than 100,000 had been captured. The magnificent Grande Army was no more, its horses were gone, its artillery lost, and its elite veteran corps buried beneath the Russian snows. The illusion of Napoleonic invincibility was permanently shattered. As the freezing, frost-bitten survivors stumbled out of the Russian wilderness into Germany, the monarchs of Europe watched in awe. The Titan had not merely bled, his grand imperial vision had been broken in the frozen abyss of the East. The war was no longer about enforcing trade blockades or securing border territories. It was now a war for the liberation of Europe, and the final, desperate struggle for Napoleon's survival was about to begin. 9. The War of Liberation and the Fall of Paris. Napoleon reached Paris late on the night of December 18, 1812, after a grueling 14-day journey across a freezing continent. His immediate arrival crushed a burgeoning political coup in the capital, but the geopolitical landscape outside France was deteriorating with terrifying speed. The catastrophic destruction of the Grande Army in the snows of Russia had completely transformed European politics. The myth of French invincibility was gone. In December 1812, Prussian General Johann David von York signed the Convention of Tauroggen, unilaterally withdrawing his Prussian corps from its forced alliance with France. Spurred by an overwhelming surge of German nationalism, King Frederick William III of Prussia signed the Treaty of Kalisz with Tsar Alexander I in February 1813, officially declaring war on France. Austria, under the cautious guidance of its brilliant Chancellor, Clemens von Metternich, quietly withdrew its troops from the French alliance and declared a state of armed neutrality, waiting to see which way the scales of fortune would tip. Together, the Allied monarchies formed the Sixth Coalition, dedicated to driving the French completely out of Germany and liberating the continent. With characteristic, extraordinary energy, Napoleon set out to build a brand new army from scratch. Working 18 hours a day, he called up the military classes of 1813, 1814, and even 1815 ahead of schedule. Old men, National Guardsmen, and young boys barely old enough to shave, affectionately dubbed the Marie-Louises after the young empress who signed the conscription decrees, were drafted, equipped, and rushed to the front lines. By the spring of 1813, through a miracle of administrative organization, Napoleon had assembled over 200,000 men along the Elbe River in Germany. However, this new army was a shadow of the veteran force buried in Russian soil. While the young conscripts fought with fierce patriotic devotion, they lacked physical stamina and tactical experience. Worse still, Napoleon suffered from a fatal, irreplaceable shortage: cavalry. Over 150,000 trained warhorses had perished in the Russian winter. Without cavalry, Napoleon could no longer conduct effective reconnaissance, protect his flanks, or pursue and destroy defeated enemy armies after a battle. In May 1813, Napoleon launched a fast offensive into Saxony. At the Battle of Lutzen, May 2, 1813, and the Battle of Bautzen, May 20 to 21, 1813, Napoleon demonstrated that his operational genius was as sharp as ever. He defeated the combined Russo-Prussian armies in two major engagements, driving them back toward Silesia. Yet, because he lacked heavy cavalry to charge down the retreating enemy, both victories were indecisive. The Allied armies withdrew in good order, leaving Napoleon with tens of thousands of casualties and very few captured guns or prisoners. Exhausted and lacking supplies, Napoleon made a fateful decision on June 4, 1813. He agreed to a temporary ceasefire, the Armistice of Pleiswitz. It was one of the greatest strategic blunders of his career. Napoleon used the 9-week armistice to refit his troops and gather fresh cavalry, but the Allies used the time far more effectively. During the negotiations in Dresden, Chancellor Metternich offered Napoleon peace terms. France could keep its natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees, if Napoleon surrendered control of Germany, Italy, and Poland. Napoleon flatly rejected the terms, believing that surrendering conquered territories would shatter his political legitimacy in France. In a famous, fiery debate with Metternich, Napoleon hurled his hat onto the floor and shouted, "Your sovereigns born on the throne can let themselves be beaten 20 times and return to their capitals. I cannot. My domination will not survive the day I cease to be strong, and consequently, feared." With the rejection of peace terms, Austria officially joined the Sixth Coalition. The Allies now possessed a crushing numerical superiority of over 500,000 men, organized into 3 massive field armies that formed a giant ring around Napoleon's forces in Saxony. Furthermore, the Allied commanders adopted a brilliant strategy crafted by the former French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who had been elected Crown Prince of Sweden, and General Karl von Clausewitz, the Trachenberg Plan. The rules of the Trachenberg Plan were simple yet lethal. Avoid direct battle with Napoleon himself. Whenever the Emperor arrived on the field with his central reserve, retreat slowly and draw him into exhausting marches. Attack Napoleon's marshals in detail. Target independent French corps commanded by Marshals Oudinot, MacDonald, Ney, and Blücher, which were spread out protecting the army's flanks and supply lines. The plan worked with devastating precision. In late August 1813, Napoleon won a brilliant tactical victory over the main Allied army at the Battle of Dresden, inflicting 40,000 casualties while losing fewer than 10,000 men. However, elsewhere along the front, his marshals suffered a string of crushing, simultaneous defeats. MacDonald was smashed at the Katzbach, Oudinot was defeated at Grossburen, and Vandame's entire corps was surrounded and captured at the Battle of Kulm. Every strategic advantage Napoleon gained at Dresden was instantly erased by the piecemeal destruction of his outer core. By October 1813, the Allied armies had completely converged on the historic Saxon city of Leipzig. Napoleon had no choice but to concentrate his remaining 190,000 men to face over 330,000 Allied troops advancing from all directions. Fought from October 16 to 19, 1813, the Battle of Leipzig, known to history as the Battle of the Nations, was the largest military conflict in human history prior to the First World War. For 3 days, 500,000 men clashed in a terrifying, apocalyptic struggle surrounding the outskirts of the city. On the first day, Napoleon launched a massive, desperate attempt to break the Allied center, but heavy Austrian cavalry reserves held the line. As the fighting dragged on, the sheer weight of Allied numbers began to tell. On October 18, a crushing blow struck Napoleon from within his own ranks. His Saxon and Württemberg allies abandoned the French cause in the middle of the battle, turning their cannons around and opening fire on the French line. Realizing that his army was in danger of being completely encircled, Napoleon ordered a night retreat across a single, narrow stone bridge spanning the Ulster River. The retreat turned into a catastrophic disaster. On the morning of October 19, a panicked French corporal prematurely blew up the bridge while thousands of French soldiers were still on the far bank, attempting to cross. Cut off from the main army, 30,000 French troops were killed or captured. The brave Polish Prince Józef Poniatowski, whom Napoleon had named a Marshal of France just 3 days earlier, drowned in the icy river while trying to swim across on horseback. The Battle of Leipzig ended French rule in Germany. Napoleon pulled the shattered remnants of his army back across the Rhine, leaving behind over 70,000 dead, wounded, or captured soldiers, along with all his territorial gains in Central Europe. By the start of 1814, the situation was desperate. To the south, British and Spanish forces under the Duke of Wellington had pushed Marshal Soult across the Pyrenees, invading southern France. To the east, Three massive Allied armies totaling over 350,000 men crossed the Rhine River, invading French soil for the first time since 1792. Facing an invasion on all fronts, Napoleon had fewer than 70,000 exhausted men to defend France. Yet, in the face of absolute ruin, Napoleon executed one of the most brilliant operational displays in military history, the 6 Days Campaign, February 10 to 15, 1814. Exploiting the fact that the Allied armies were advancing along separate roads toward Paris, Napoleon moved with lightning speed, striking the isolated columns of Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's Prussian army. In 6 days, at the battles of Champaubat, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vorchams, Napoleon defeated Blücher's forces 4 times in rapid succession, inflicting nearly 20,000 casualties while suffering minimal losses. Moving southwest, he then struck and defeated the main Austrian army under Prince Schwarzenberg at the Battle of Monteiro. Foreign military observers watched in awe as the emperor, commanding a tiny force of teenage conscripts, maneuvered with the speed, daring, and precision of his famous 1796 Italian campaign. However, brilliant tactical victories could no longer alter the stark strategic reality. Napoleon could not be everywhere at once. Every time he turned to strike one army, another advanced toward Paris. Worse still, the French nation was completely exhausted. 22 years of continuous warfare had drained the population of its youth, ruined trade, and destroyed public finances. The French people wanted peace, and the political elite in Paris were preparing to abandon the emperor. On March 9, 1814, the coalition allies signed the Treaty of Chaumont, pledging to remain united until Napoleon was completely overthrown. Recognizing that he could not stop the Allied march in open battle, Napoleon executed a bold, dangerous strategic maneuver. He marched east into the enemy's rear, intending to cut the Ally supply lines and force them to turn around and follow him away from the capital. The Allied commanders hesitatingly considered following him, but an intercepted message revealed Napoleon's plan. Furthermore, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand secretly dispatched a coded message to the Tsar from inside Paris, urging him to march straight for the capital. You can achieve everything, but you must dare it. March on Paris. Leaving a small screen of cavalry to distract Napoleon, the combined Allied armies launched a rapid march directly on Paris. On March 30, 1814, the Battle of Paris erupted on the heights of Montmartre and Belleville. Defending the city were fewer than 20,000 regular soldiers and National Guardsmen under the command of King Joseph Bonaparte and Marshals Marmont and Mortier. As Austrian and Russian columns stormed the heights with heavy artillery, King Joseph panicked and fled the city, authorizing Marshal Auguste de Marmont to negotiate a surrender. At 2 o'clock on the morning of March 31, 1814, Marshal Marmont signed the capitulation of Paris. A few hours later, Tsar Alexander I of Russia and King Frederick William III of Prussia rode through the grand streets of the French capital at the head of their glittering Guards regiments. For the first time since the end of the 100 Years' War, Paris was occupied by foreign invaders. Napoleon was at Fontainebleau, 40 miles south of Paris, when news reached him that his capital had surrendered. Refusing to accept defeat, Napoleon began assembling his remaining 50,000 troops, preparing to launch a desperate, bloody assault to recapture Paris. On April 4, 1814, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon gathered his senior commanders, including Marshals Ney, Oudinot, MacDonald, Lefebvre, and Montcy, to issue orders for the attack. The marshals stood in cold, silent defiance. "The army will follow me," Napoleon declared passionately. Marshal Michel Ney stepped forward, looked his emperor in the eyes, and uttered the crushing truth, "Sire, the army will obey its generals. The army will not march." "What do you want then?" Napoleon asked softly. "An abdication," Ney replied directly. Napoleon was stunned. The men he had raised from obscurity, transformed into wealthy dukes and princes, and covered in glory, were refusing to fight. When news arrived hours later that Marshal Marmont had taken his entire 6th Corps and defected to the enemy, surrounding the Allied position with a shield of French troops, Napoleon realized that his political and military leverage was completely gone. On April 6, 1814, sitting in his study at Fontainebleau, Napoleon picked up a pen and signed his official, unconditional abdication. The Allied powers having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the sole obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces, for himself and his heirs, the thrones of France and Italy. In the dark hours of the night on April 12, overwhelmed by despair and betrayal, Napoleon attempted to take his own life. He drank a vial of poison, a mixture of opium and belladonna, that he had carried in a silk pouch around his neck since the near capture at Malyaroslevets during the Russian retreat. However, the poison had lost its potency over 2 years. It caused him severe stomach cramps and vomiting, but failed to kill him. He survived. Fate was not yet finished with Napoleon Bonaparte. Under the Treaty of Fontainebleau, negotiated by the Allies, the Bourbon monarchy was restored to the throne of France in the person of Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed Louis XVI. In exchange for surrendering his empire, Napoleon was granted full sovereignty over a tiny, rocky island in the Mediterranean off the coast of Tuscany, Elba. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor, granted an annual pension of 2 million francs, and permitted a personal guard of 600 loyal soldiers. On April 20, 1814, in the grand courtyard of the Palace of Fontainebleau, thereafter known as the Cour des Adieus, Napoleon stepped out to bid farewell to the men of his old guard. Standing before the weeping veterans who had marched with him from the pyramids of Egypt to the frozen plains of Russia, Napoleon held the imperial eagle banner to his chest and kissed it, his voice trembling with emotion. "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have found you constantly on the path of honor and glory. I go, but you, my friends, will continue to serve France. Do not lament my fate. If I have decided to survive, it is to serve your glory. I wish to write the great deeds we have accomplished together. Farewell, my children. I wish I could press you all to my heart." Napoleon boarded a simple carriage bound for the southern coast, escorted by foreign officers. As he traveled through the fiercely royalist towns of Provence, angry crowds surrounded his carriage, burning him in effigy and screaming for his death. To escape being lynched, the former emperor of the French was forced to disguise himself in an Austrian officer's uniform and ride on horseback ahead of the party. On May 4, 1814, aboard the British frigate HMS Undaunted, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped ashore onto the small, rocky island of Elba. The Titan who had ruled 70 million people from Madrid to Warsaw was now the ruler of an island 18 miles long, with a population of 12,000 peasants. To the crowned heads of Europe, assembling in Vienna for a grand diplomatic congress to celebrate their triumph and redraw the map of the world, the Napoleonic storm was permanently over. The usurper was caged, the ancient order was restored, and Europe could finally sleep in peace. They had underestimated Napoleon one last time. 10. The 100 Days and the Final Curtain. The rocky, iron-paved shores of Elba were never going to be enough to hold Napoleon Bonaparte. For 10 months, he kept himself feverishly occupied, behaving as if his tiny island realm were a grand empire. He laid down new roads, reorganized iron mines, drained malarial marshes, overhauled the tax system, and designed a new flag for his tiny guard. Yet, as he paced the gardens of the Palazzina dei Mulini overlooking the Mediterranean, his eyes remained fixed on France. Through a network of loyal informants, Napoleon watched the political climate in Paris rapidly deteriorate. The restored Bourbon monarch, Louis XVIII, was proving deeply unpopular. While the fat, gout-afflicted king had promised to respect revolutionary liberties, he was surrounded by ultra-royalist émigrés who demanded the return of their confiscated lands and the restoration of absolute monarchy. Thousands of veteran army officers were placed on half-pay, while young noblemen who had never smelled gunpowder were given high military ranks. Worse still, news reached Napoleon that the great powers meeting at the Congress of Vienna were squabbling bitterly over the spoils of Europe, and considering exiling him even further away, to the lonely rock of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Napoleon decided to strike before his enemies could act. On the dark night of February 26, 1815, while the British commissioner supervising the island was away in Florence, Napoleon slipped out of the harbor aboard his flagship, the Inconstant, accompanied by a small fleet carrying his 600 loyal guardsmen. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon stepped ashore onto the French mainland at Golfe-Juan, near Cannes. Launching one of the most audacious gambles in political history, Napoleon set off on a northward march through the rugged, snow-covered Alps toward Paris, a track today known as the Route Napoleon. He carried no weapons, no heavy artillery, and fewer than 1,000 men. His strategy relied entirely on a single asset, his legendary relationship with the French army. The crucial moment came on March 7, 1815, near the town of Laffrey, just south of Grenoble. Blocking the narrow mountain road was the 5th Regiment of the Line, sent by Louis XVIII to arrest or kill the usurper. As the two forces stood face to face, their muskets loaded, Napoleon stepped out ahead of his own troops. He unbuttoned his famous grey overcoat, bared his chest to the royalist line, and called out into the tense silence. "Soldiers of the 5th, I am your emperor. If there is one among you who would kill his general, his emperor, here I am." A long moment of agonizing silence hung over the meadow. Then, a single shout echoed from the ranks, "Vive l'Empereur!" The royalist soldiers broke formation, threw down their muskets, rushed forward, and threw themselves at Napoleon's feet, weeping and embracing his knees. The force sent to arrest him had become his vanguard. The scene repeated itself at every step. When Marshal Michel Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, was sent with a major force to intercept him, Ney's own men cheered the emperor. Swayed by his old loyalty and the overwhelming momentum of the army, Ney defected, joining Napoleon once again. As Napoleon advanced, the famous French political writer Madame de Staël noted that his army grew without firing a single shot. A popular satirical flyer posted in the Place Vendôme in Paris summarized the journey perfectly. From Napoleon to Louis XVIII, "My good brother, there is no need to send any more troops. I have enough." On the midnight of March 19, 1815, King Louis XVIII fled Paris in terror, escaping across the border to Belgium. The following evening, March 20, 1815, on his son's 4th birthday, Napoleon rode into the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace in Paris. An ecstatic crowd of thousands of soldiers and civilians surrounded his carriage, lifted the emperor onto their shoulders, and carried him up the grand staircase into his former quarters. The miraculous bloodless reconquest of France was complete. The 100 Days had begun. However, Napoleon's return sent shockwaves of fury through the diplomatic halls of Vienna. Abandoning their territorial rivalries, the Allied powers reacted with absolute unity. On March 13, 1815, the foreign powers declared Napoleon an international outlaw and a disturber of the tranquility of the world. Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia formed the 7th Coalition, pledging to keep 700,000 men in the field until Napoleon was permanently crushed. They were not fighting France, they were waging a personal war against one man. Napoleon tried desperately to send peace letters to the crowned heads of Europe, assuring them that he had returned a changed man who wanted only peace and internal constitutional reform for France. Every letter was returned unopened. Realizing that war was inevitable, Napoleon mobilized the French nation. Through extraordinary effort, he assembled a field force of 123,000 men, the Armée du Nord, made up almost entirely of experienced, fiercely loyal veterans. However, the coalition armies were advancing on France from all directions. Two enemy forces were assembling just north of the French border in Belgium, an Anglo-Dutch German army of 93,000 men under Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army of 116,000 men under the fiery, 72-year-old Field Marshal Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher. Together, Wellington and Blücher outnumbered Napoleon 2-1. But they were spread out, waiting for Austrian and Russian armies to reach the Rhine before launching a coordinated invasion. Napoleon recognized his only strategic chance: strike immediately, slip his army between Wellington and Blücher before they could combine, defeat each army separately in a swift, lightning campaign, and force Great Britain and Prussia out of the war. On June 15, 1815, Napoleon launched a rapid surprise invasion into Belgium, crossing the Sambre River and capturing Charleroi. The campaign opened with dramatic success. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon split his army into two wings to strike both enemies simultaneously. At the Battle of Ligny, Napoleon personally commanded the center and right wing against Blücher's Prussians. In a vicious, bloody fight around stone villages, Napoleon smashed the Prussian center. Blücher was trapped beneath his dead horse during a cavalry charge and nearly captured. The Prussians lost over 20,000 men, but their chief of staff, August von Gneisenau, organized a disciplined retreat northward toward Wavre. At the Battle of Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney commanded the French left wing against Wellington's Anglo-Dutch forces, holding Wellington in place and preventing him from sending aid to the Prussians at Ligny. Napoleon believed he had achieved his goal. He assumed the defeated Prussians were retreating east toward their supply bases near the Rhine. Napoleon made a crucial error. He appointed Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy to command a 33,000-man detachment and ordered him to pursue the retreating Prussians. However, Grouchy moved too slowly, losing touch with the Prussian main force. Blücher, refusing to admit defeat, marched north to Wavre, placing his army in a position to march west and support Wellington. Wellington, relying on a firm promise from Blücher that the Prussians would come to his aid, fell back to a carefully chosen defensive position 9 miles south of Brussels, near the small market village of Waterloo. Sunday, June 18, 1815, dawned cold and grey over the rolling farmland of Waterloo. Torrential rain had poured down all night, soaking the fields and turning the deep clay soil into a thick, muddy soup. Wellington had deployed his 68,000 troops along the crest of the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, hiding much of his infantry behind the reverse slope to protect them from artillery fire. His strong defensive line was anchored by two fortified stone complexes in front of his position, the Chateau of Hougoumont on his right, and the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in his center. Napoleon commanded 72,000 men. He possessed a clear superiority in artillery and heavy cavalry, but the muddy ground created a fatal delay. Because heavy cannonballs would sink harmlessly into the soft mud rather than ricochet through infantry ranks, Napoleon delayed his initial assault until 11:30 in the morning, waiting for the sun to dry the ground. That 3-hour delay would prove to be the difference between victory and ultimate ruin. The Battle of Waterloo opened with a fierce French assault on the gates of Hougoumont. Intended as a tactical feint to draw Wellington's reserves away from the center, the struggle for Hougoumont turned into a desperate, meat-grinder battle within a battle. For 7 hours, British Coldstream Guards held the stone chateau against wave after wave of furious French attacks. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon prepared to launch his main assault against Wellington's center. A massive grand battery of 80 heavy cannons opened fire, tearing into the ridge. Immediately following the bombardment, 16,000 French infantry under General D'Erlon marched forward in dense columns, surging up the slope toward La Haye-Sainte. The French columns broke through Wellington's front line, but as they crested the ridge, a British brigade under Sir Thomas Picton launched a surprise counterattack. At that exact moment, 2 regiments of heavy British cavalry, the Royal Scots Greys and the Household Brigade, charged down the slope. Their heavy horses smashed directly into the flank of the packed French infantry columns, hacking through the ranks and sending D'Erlon's corps fleeing down the hill in total confusion. As the smoke cleared over the center, Napoleon looked through his spyglass to the eastern horizon. Out of the distant woods near the village of Chapel St. Lambert, dark columns of troops were emerging. It was not Grouchy returning with reinforcements. It was the vanguard of Blücher's Prussian army. Realizing his time was running out, Napoleon was forced to detach his reserve infantry, the 6th Corps under Count Lobau, to hold back the advancing Prussians at the village of Planzenite on his right flank. On the main ridge, believing Wellington's centre was beginning to crumble after La Haye Sainte was heavily damaged, Marshal Michel Ney executed an impulse decision. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ney organized a massive, unsupported cavalry charge. Over 5,000 French heavy cavalry, cuirassiers in gleaming breastplates, red lance lancers, and dragoons, poured across the valley and crested the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. Wellington reacted instantly, ordering his infantry to form tight, bristling tactical squares, hollow walls of soldiers facing outward with 3 rows of bayonets. What followed was one of the most dramatic spectacles in military history. For 2 agonizing hours, wave after wave of French cavalry thundered around the British squares. The earth shook as 10,000 horsemen circled the bayonets, but without infantry or horse artillery support, they could not break the stubborn infantry formations. The British squares held, pouring devastating point-blank volleys into the swirling sea of horses and men. By 6 o'clock, Ney finally captured the stone farmhouse of La Haye Sainte. French horse artillery unlimbered close to the ridge, blasting Wellington's centre with grapeshot. Wellington's centre was on the verge of collapsing, gaps opened in his line, and his officers begged for reinforcements. Wellington, watching his line crumble, looked at his watch and murmured, "Give me night, or give me Blücher." Ney urgently requested fresh infantry from Napoleon to deliver the final blow. But Napoleon refused, claiming he had no troops to spare because Lobau was locked in a life-or-death fight with 30,000 Prussians at Planzenite. By 7 o'clock, the French Young Guard managed to clear Planzenite, temporarily securing Napoleon's flank. With the Prussians closing in fast and Wellington's line hanging by a thread, Napoleon knew he had to commit his ultimate, sacred reserve. He called up the Imperial Guard. For 15 years, these elite veterans, the grognards, grumblers, had never been defeated. They had marched across Europe, their tall bearskin caps towering over the battlefield. At 7:30 in the evening, 9 battalions of the Imperial Guard stepped forward, marching up the slope of Mont Saint-Jean, led on foot by Marshal Ney, whose 5th horse of the day had just been shot out from under him. The Guard advanced with magnificent, steady precision through a storm of grapeshot. But Wellington was waiting for them. As the lead battalion reached the crest, Wellington stood up from behind the ridge and shouted his famous command to his hidden foot guards, "Up, guards, and at them again." Over 1,500 British foot guards stood up out of the tall rye grass in a single line, taking precise aim at 30 paces. They unleashed a deafening, continuous volley of musket fire straight into the front ranks of the Imperial Guard, dropping hundreds of men in seconds. Simultaneously, a Dutch-Belgian brigade under General Chas and a British light infantry regiment under Sir John Colborne struck the Guard on both flanks. For the first time in its legendary history, the Imperial Guard faltered, stopped, and began to fall back down the hill. A shockwave of terror rippled through the French army. Soldiers along the entire line looked on in disbelief and raised the fatal cry, "La Garde recule." The Guard is retreating. At that exact moment, Blücher's main army broke through the French right at Planzenite, and Wellington rode to the edge of the ridge, raising his hat high in the air to order a general, sweeping advance. The French army collapsed into total, catastrophic panic. The retreat turned into a wild rout. Thousands of soldiers threw down their muskets and fled across the fields as Prussian cavalry rode through the dark night, hunting down stragglers. Only the 3 remaining battalions of the Old Guard, forming tight squares at the foot of the hill around their Imperial Eagle banners, held their ground to protect their emperor's escape. Surrounded by 3 armies and under heavy artillery fire, British officers called out demanding their surrender. According to legend, General Pierre Cambron issued a fierce, immortal reply, "La Garde meurt, elle ne se rend pas." The Guard dies, it does not surrender. Or, as others reported, a single, coarse French curse, "Merde." The old guard fought to the last man, dying where they stood to buy Napoleon time to ride away into the darkness. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Over 47,000 men lay dead or wounded on a field less than 3 square miles in size. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21, exhausted and crushed. Hoping to raise another army, he found no support left in the legislature. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon signed his second, final abdication in favor of his young son. Fleeing to the western port city of Rochefort, Napoleon attempted to secure passage on a ship bound for the United States, dreaming of a quiet life studying science in America. But the Royal Navy had placed a total blockade on all French ports. Realizing escape was impossible, Napoleon chose to surrender to his greatest, most persistent enemy. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon stepped aboard the British warship HMS Bellerophon, writing a famous letter to the Prince Regent of Great Britain. Your Royal Highness, exposed to the factions which divide my country, I have terminated my political career, and I come, like Themistocles, to seat myself at the hearth of the British people. I put myself under the protection of their laws. The British government, however, had no intention of granting him asylum in an English country estate. They were determined that Napoleon Bonaparte would never again return to trouble the peace of the world. Napoleon was transferred to the 74-gun HMS Northumberland and dispatched under heavy naval guard to the most remote, isolated location on Earth, St. Helena, a volcanic island of barren black cliffs rising out of the stormy waters of the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest coast of Africa. For 6 long years, the Titan who had ruled Europe lived as a prisoner at Longwood House, a damp, windswept former farmstead on the high plateau of the island. He was placed under the petty, obsessive surveillance of the island's British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, who refused to address him as emperor, referring to him strictly as General Bonaparte. Yet, even in exile, Napoleon executed his final, brilliant campaign, the construction of his own historical legacy. Spending his long days dictating his memoirs to a small group of loyal companions, principally the Count de Las Cases, Napoleon crafted his narrative. He reframed his life not as that of a ruthless military conqueror, but as the martyr of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, a visionary leader who had fought to unify Europe, abolish feudalism, and build a world based on modern legal equality. Published after his death as the Memorial de Sainte Helene, these memoirs captivated the world, giving birth to the romantic myth of Napoleonic legend. In early 1821, Napoleon's health failed rapidly. He suffered from severe stomach pain, persistent vomiting, and extreme weakness, a condition likely caused by stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. On the evening of May 5, 1821, as a fierce hurricane swept over the island, tearing up trees around Longwood House, Napoleon Bonaparte lay dying in his bed. Shortly before 6 o'clock, his eyes fluttered, and he uttered his final, fragmented words. France, l'armée, tête d'armée. Josephine. France, the army, head of the army. Josephine. He was 51 years old. 19 years later, in 1840, King Louis-Philippe of France secured permission from the British government to bring Napoleon's remains back home to the soil he had loved so deeply. On a freezing December day in 1840, hundreds of thousands of French citizens lined the streets of Paris in silent awe as a grand, golden hearse carried Napoleon's coffin through the Arc de Triomphe, the grand monument he had commissioned after Austerlitz, down the Champs-Élysées. Today, Napoleon Bonaparte rests inside 6 concentric coffins beneath the magnificent golden dome of Les Invalides in the heart of Paris. Surrounding his magnificent red quartzite tomb are carved the words from his final will. I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so much. The storm that had consumed a continent for 2 decades was finally at rest, leaving behind a transformed world, a unified code of law, and an immortal legacy carved permanently into the history of human civilization. Thank you for listening if you have made it this far. Take care and good night. See you in the next video.